Hi everyone, I am Dream Into Wealth. I know people watching this are trying to fall asleep. How are you? And I hope you are okay in life. Listen to my story and make yourself comfortable. Also, if y'all like this kind of stories, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. The rain had been falling steady that night, hitting the tin roof of my porch like 1,000 nickels dropped by a careless guy. Out beyond the fence, the prairie stretched long and lonely, the kind of land that swallowed sound whole. I sat there with my boots crossed and a half-burnt lantern glowing weak beside me, holding my old ledger on my knee. Not a ledger for cattle or trade, mind you, just one for life. Names, places, debts paid, debts owed. Funny thing how a man starts keeping score once he's too old to run from his own arithmetic. Now, I ain't no preacher nor banker, but I reckon I've learned more about money than most folk who count it for a living. See, money like fire. It don't care who holds it, it just burns for whoever knows how to tend it. Some men try to grab too much too fast, and it eats them clean through. Others let it die cold, and they freeze staring at what could have been. Took it near 40 years to learn that lesson proper. And by the time I did, my beard had gone silver, my bones had started protesting, and the only thing left that felt young was my memory. Back when I was just a wild colt of a man, I rode with a crew that taught themselves the dust drifters. We weren't outlaws, but we weren't saints either. We dug claims, traded iron, chased rumors of gold across half the territory. Some months we'd strike enough to buy a bottle of the good stuff and a week rest. Most months we'd have struck blisters, but every one of us believed the next dig would be the one that changed it. That the curse of youth, thinking every sunrise a fresh start when real, it another tally mark on a long, unbalanced account. I remember one of them clear as day, Julius, the youngest of us, barely 19, full of spark. He'd sit by the fire at night, talking about how he'd buy a stretch of land so wide he could ride 3 days and still not hit the end. He carried a little notebook with him, scribbling every idea that crossed his mind, what he'd build, what he'd grow, what he'd save. I laughed at him once, caught him dreaming rich. He smiled and said, "Dreams don't stay dreams 'cause folks spend more time talking than calculating." This stuck with him more than I cared to admit. The next spring, Elias struck something in the East Ridge, a vein of gold so fine it glittered like dawn light on dew. We thought we'd all be kings by summer, but he didn't rush. No, sir, not him. He staked the claim careful, kept his mouth shut, worked slow. Every other man in town laughed at him for not cashing out early. 6 months later, the rest of us were broke and moving on to the next dream, while Elias sat on steady pay, selling ounces, not promises. That boy had more sense than the whole camp combined. I didn't see him for near 5 years after that. When I did, he bought that stretch of land he talked about, a quiet valley cut by a river, fat cat grazing where once there was dust. He'd built a house too, not big but clean, and he'd married a school teacher who could make a room feel like springtime. When he saw me redding up, he didn't brag, didn't boast, just handed it a cup of coffee and said, "You finally ready to learn how to make the gold work for you instead of the other way around?" I stayed with him that winter, working the ranch, watching how he ran things. And that when I learned the difference between rich and wealthy. Rich was what we chased in the mines, fast, loud, burning bright and quick. Wealthy was what Elias built, slow, quiet, compound in the soil, in the herd, in the habits. He'd say every coin a seed, old friend. Plant it where it'll grow even when you're gone. At first I thought he was just speaking fancy, but the more I watched, the more I understood. He didn't gamble on guesses, he planned on patience. He kept ledgers not to show off numbers, but to measure time. His cows fed his fields fed his cattle. Every piece had purpose. And on nights when the fire crackled and the rain came soft on the roof, he'd sit and teach you the simplest truths that most men spend their lives ignorant. Don't measure your worth by what you own. Measure by what earns while you sleep. Don't chase quicksilver when steady stone will build you shelter. Don't let hunger for more blind you to enough. Those words took root deep, deeper than gold Dad did. I stayed to spring, then moved on, built my own small trade line, hauling supplies from the rail yards to the mountain camps. Nothing fancy, steady work, steady pay. And every week I'd put a piece aside. I didn't bury it before. I planted it in tools and land and men who worked honest. Took years before I felt it growing, but one morning I realized I didn't need to chase anymore.
The work worked for me.
Funny thing, wealth, it ain't the pile, it's the peace. That peace only comes when a man stops measuring his fortune in noise and starts counting it in quiet mornings like this, rain hitting a tin roof, and a heart that finally ain't restless no more. When I came back to that valley years later, it was quieter than I remembered. The wind still whistled through the fence posts, the grass still waved in long golden tides, but the laughter was gone. Elias was buried up on the hill beneath a lone cottonwood that leaned a little eastward. The lake had been listening too long to the wind and forgot how to stand straight. His wife was older then, kind eyes still, though grief had softened their shine. She greeted me with that same steady calm he once carried, and if she'd learned how to hold the world without letting it slip through her fingers. "I knew you'd come," she said, handing me a small wooden box. "He left this for you." The box wasn't much to look at, plain cedar, worn smooth from years of sitting by a bedside. I didn't open it right away. We sat there on the porch a while, watching the light stretch over the fields, the kind of light that makes you forget the years you lost. After she went inside, I stayed out, the box heavy in my lap. Finally, I lifted the lid. Inside was his old notebook, the same one he'd scribbled in by firelight when we were boys chasing gold and ghosts. The pages were yellowed now, the corners curled, but the ink still held strong. Right on the first page, written in that careful hand of his, were the words, "The rhythm of a man's life should match the rhythm of the earth's flow, patient and certain." Beneath it was a letter sealed with wax. I broke it open gentle. "If you're reading this, old friend, I reckon the wind already taken thee. Don't mourn me, I lived rich, not in coins, but in time. You taught thee once how to swing a pick, I figured it fair. I teach you how to lay one down. Wealth ain't about what you take from the earth, what you build that keeps on breathing when you're gone. If you forget that, look out over this valley. Every blade of grass here started in dust. Every ounce of dust learned patience." I sat there a long while, the rain whispering against the porch rail, that letter shaking a little in my hand. I could almost hear his laugh again, that easy one he saved for moments when life felt too heavy to carry alone. It hit me then. Elias hadn't built his wealth just in land or cattle. He built it in continuance. He'd found a way to make his life compound in the lives of others. His workers owned shares in his ranch. His school teacher wife ran a fund that paid for any child in the valley who wanted to learn more than their parents could teach. His wealth wasn't hoarded. It circulated, like rain through soil, feeding everything around it. That realization burned clean through me. I'd spent decades stacking ledgers and fixing wagons, thinking I was doing fine, but I'd never once asked if the gold I'd had was growing or just sitting. Elias had turned his gold into something alive, something that keeps singing long after the singer was gone. That night I walked down by the river where the cattle came to drink. The stars were hid behind the clouds, but the water caught the lantern light and scattered it in ripples. I thought about the men we'd been, the fools who measured fortune in weight instead of worth. Then I took out my own ledger and flipped to the last page. I tore it out, the one where I'd been keeping track of debts, and tossed it in the river, watched it drift away like that old regret. Then I opened a new page and wrote one word at the top, growth. The next morning I rode into town and sold half my wagons. Took the profit and bought a patch of land near the valley, small but fertile. I hired a few hands, not to haul or mine, but to build something new, a mill, not a big one, just enough to grind the local grain without folks needing to travel miles to the city. The townsfolk thought I'd lost my wits. Why build a mill when the city pays more for transport, they asked. I just smiled and told them, because this seed pays forward. The first year was rough. The rains came late, the gears jammed twice, and we barely broke even. But the second year, the crops grew thicker and the mill turned steady. By the third, I wasn't just grinding grain, I was grinding future. The farmers pooled their yields, shared their profits, and reinvested in the next harvest. The same men who once haggled for every cent now spoke in shares and plans. Elias had been right all along. When you teach a man to work with time instead of against it, he stops living by hunger and starts living by harvest. And let to tell you something, seeing that change happen, it like watching dawn rake over cold land. It ain't loud or sudden. It creeps soft and slow, till one day you realize the frost is gone and everything blooms. That how wealth works when it honest, quiet, steady, like faith. Private. I never grew rich by the world reckoning, never owned a railroad, never ran for office, never sat at a table carved from another man's labor. But when I'd walk through that town years later and see children wearing boots their fathers could afford, or families trading fair without debt weighing down their shoulders, I knew my investment had paid the only dividend that matters deeply. The years rolled on, and my beard turned white. The mill became part of the valley heartbeat. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky burned gold, I hit my old ledger again, flipped through every name, every number, every note from a life half chased, half earned. At the end, I wrote another word under growth piece. Then I closed it, not because I was done, but because I'd finally learned the secret all them old prospect narratives never did. Wealth ain't in the weight of your gold, it in how light your soul feels when you've shared it. That night, the rain came again, soft, slow, rhythmic, and for the first time, I didn't count it a storm, I counted it the profit. It was near 10 years later when a young drifter came riding through the valley, hat pulled low, horse-looking, half-starved, and eyes full of the same fire I once carried. He stopped by the mill, asked for water and maybe a meal if I could spare it. I poured him a cup, watched the way his hands trembled when he held it, not from cold, but from the weight of too many empty days behind him. He said his name was Jesse, though I reckon that wasn't the one he was born with. Didn't matter much. He was the kind of boy you could tell had already lost more than most men twice his age. I asked him where he was headed. He shrugged. Wherever they say the pay good. I chuckled low, that deep, tired kind of laugh that cuts from seeing two-made roads that all lead to the say dead ends. Son, I said, you keep chasing where the pay good, you'll die rich in promises and poor in peace. He looked at me strange, yet I'd spoken in a tongue on ghosts understood, so I poured him another cup and said, sit a spell. Ain't nothing you about a man named Elias now. I told it slow, the way a man should when the truth worth hearing. I spoke of the gold rush, the dust, the mistakes, and how Elias turned all that restless hunger into a quiet kind of wealth that fed generations. The boy listened close, though I could see that half his heart was still running somewhere far beyond my porch. When I finished, he sat quiet for a bit, then said, so what do you do when you ain't got land, ain't got gold, ain't got a start? I leaned back, letting the chair creak under thee. Then you start with what no man could take from you, time and attention. Most folks waste both faster than whiskey. He frowned, not quite fine. What good time if it don't feed you? I smiled, same way Elias once had at me. Every man got to eat, sure, but what fills your belly today won't fill your life tomorrow. The trick ain't finding food, it's learning to plant that got him thinking. I could see the sparks flicker behind them tired eyes. Pride pain. See what happens. I offered him work not spending no for contrivances of haul and grain. He took it without question. For weeks he labbed quiet, never complaining, did watching, and I let him. Sometimes the best way to teach a man about wealth is to let the land whisper it into him. One night, after we'd closed the mill and the moon was rising pale over the ridge, he came and sat beside me. I think I get what you mean, he said. You're saying you build wealth the same way you build a fire, small, careful, steady. I nodded. That right. Too much coddling and you burn out fast, but feed it slow, let it breathe, and it'll keep you warm long after the fools freeze. He grinned then, my real one, the first I'd seen. But how do you start if all you got is sparks? I pointed to his calloused hands. Them right there are more than most men, and as proper. Find a trade that pays honest, live lean, and save steady. Don't rush to spend on what shines, spend on what stays. The goal ain't to own much, it to own nothing. He reached that. Freer than kings. Jesse took that to heart. Next it he earned, he didn't vote it down like the others. He handed it to me and said, can you keep this safe till I have enough to start something? I didn't ask what something meant. I just nodded and knocked it in the drawer. Where Elias' old ledger used to sit. Months passed, seasons turned. He saved near every coin. Sometimes I'd test him, telling him about new ventures or big opportunities the traders spoke of, just to see if he'd bite. But he'd shake his head. Not yet, he'd say, I ain't building a pile, I'm building a path. That boy was learning. I'll be damned if it didn't make me proud. By the second year, he'd saved enough to buy a stretch of barren land near the river bend, rocky rough, not much to look at. The kind of land men passed over because they couldn't see past its scars.
Now, we built a small cabin there, did one room and a roof good enough to keep out the rain. He planted barley first, then rye, worked the soil day and night. The first harvest was meager, but he didn't curse it, just smiled, said, next year will be better. And sure enough, it was. By the 5th year, his land fed 3 families. By the 10th, it supplied half the valley. He built a granary beside the river, and every man who helped earned a share in what they stored. He didn't hoard a thing. He let it flow profit, work, growth, all in rhythm. I watched him from the same porch where I once sat broke and lost, and I thought, Elias would like this one. Jesse came by often, still humble, still asking questions. One night, as the rain came soft again, he asked me, when do you think a man truly rich? I took a long breath, listening to that steady patter. When he got more peace than plans, I said, when his money works harder than he does.
Granny Point, And when he'd sit in the rain and not worry what it costing him, he nodded slow, like he was writing it somewhere deep. Then he said something I'll never forget. Then I reckon I ain't far off, 'cause I stopped worrying about losing what I ain't scared to share. I smiled that when I knew the cycle had turned full, the wealth Elias planted had bloomed again, not in numbers, but in men who understood the worth of patience. That how legacies last, not by inheritance, but by example. Years later, when I was too old to ride far, Jesse took over the mill. He fixed the roof, expanded the storehouse, taught the younger ones to save he once learned. Folks started calling him the quiet banker, though he never worked a day inside a bank. And when I asked him why he never left for bigger lands, he said, why chase the horizon when you can own the sunrise? And I tell you, that line right there, that the kind you carve in stone, years rolled on and the valley grew gentle with time. Perfidas. The fields fattened, the river ran slower, and the wind seemed to carry more laughter than dust. I'd sit on that same porch with my blanket draped over my shoulders, watching the younger men and women haul sacks of grain, barter fare, build homes that stood sturdy through the seasons. Some days, I'd close my eyes and swear I could hear the echoes of all those who came before, Elias, the old drifters, even my younger self, floating between the raindrops and the cicadas. That the thing about time, when you spend it right, it doesn't vanish, it settles like good soil after a storm. Jesse had turned the mill into more than a trade house. It was a heart beating steady for the whole valley. He'd set up a small goo next to it, one room with a big open window so the breeze could pass through while the children learned. Their laughter mixed with the sound of the grinding wheel, and every time I heard it, I thought, that wealth right there, not the kind you lock in a vault, but the kind you live long enough to see multiplied in voices and futures.
Probably your paper didn't smile. I remember one particular evening, the rain coming in sideways, cold as Jesse came by after closing up the mill, stomping the mud from his boot. They carried 2 cups and that same old coffee pot I passed 20 years old. We poured slow, steam curling up into the lamplight. For a while, we didn't talk at it. The rain filled the silence better than words it could. Then he said, you think we got lucky? I smiled. Look, what folks call patient, they don't understand. He nodded. Looking out toward the fields, I reckon I believe that now. When I first came here, I thought all a man needed was a big rake, something sudden, something grand. But I learned the world don't work in fireworks. It works in embers. He paused, sipping slow, his eyes catching the glow of the lantern. When you told us about Elias, I didn't get it. Not really. But now seeing these kids growing up fed, seeing the town trade fair, nobody starved, but I get it. The man didn't just strike gold, he struck continuance. That where he'd be hard, continuance.
It was the same lesson that had taken half a lifetime to understand. I told him, wealth ain't a finish line, Jesse. It a relay. You just keep passing it forward till someone faster, wiser, or kinder carries it further than you or could. He leaned back, the rain pattering soft now, a rhythm like an old lullaby humming through the eaves. Then, I guess we're just caretakers, he said, stewards of what'll outlive us. I nodded. That all any good man it was. Days turned to months, and the seasons kept their quiet dance. My hands grew weaker, my legs slower, but my mind, well, it stayed sharp enough to count what mattered. And one morning, and the sun cracked open the sky in a spill of amber light, I decided it was time to write the last page in my ledger. Not with numbers, but with names. Elias, Jesse. The families of the valley. Each one a deposit in a bank that needed no walls. I left that ledger on the porch rail, pages fluttering in the breeze like the wings of something finally free. When Jesse found it later that day, he didn't add to it. He just closed it and placed it in the cedar box that Elias' letter once rested and carved one word into the lid with his knife. Continuance. Years after I was gone, that word became the name of the Valley Trade Guild, the Continuance Cooperative. They ran their affairs with the same rules Elias had written down by firelight. Share in labor, invest in patience, measure in decades, not days. The people prospered, but not in the way city folk counted. They prospered in stability, in trust, in legacy. When drought came, they rationed fare. When flood hit, they rebuilt tether. Not a man went hungry, not a child went uneducated. The land that once fed greed now fed gratitude. And sometimes, when the thunder rolled distant and the rain swept in soft, the old mill creaked out it was humming a tune. A tune I knew well, the song of cycles, of work turning into wealth and wealth turning into wisdom. A reminder that time, when tended like soil, yields harvest no ledger could have measure. The townsfolk built a small statue near the cottonwood where Elias rested. Nothing fancy, just him sitting with that notebook on his knee looking out over the land he'd once dreamed about. Below it they carved, "He planted patience, we harvested peace," and next to it they placed a smaller plaque, my name and Jesse side by side with the words, "Keep the fire slow, the hand steady, and the heart humble." Every now and then, a traveler still comes through the valley asking what built such a place. The locals just smile, often bread, maybe a cup of coffee, and say it started with a miner who stopped digging and started listening. I reckon that how every good fortune begins, not with gold in the ground, but with a man willing to let silence teach him what haste never will. The kind of silence that comes when rain meets roof, when dusk meets dawn, when work meets purpose. And maybe, if they're lucky, they'll sit long enough by that statue to hear what I still hear in my sleep. The sound of coins not clinking but settling, of dreams not rushing but rooting, of life not passing but continuing. That the real wealth, son, the kind that don't fade when the rain stops, the kind that hums forever like the echo of old campfire story told one more time beneath a patient sky. The years after that statue was raised were quieter, slower, like the world had finally found its rhythm again. There weren't any more rushes for gold, no more traders bragging about fortunes made overnight. The valley folk had learned something far richer than the promise of quick profit. They'd learned balance, and balance, once found, is a kind of wealth no coin can buy. By then, the mill had become the valley anchor. It wasn't yet a place to grind grain. It was where men talked, women shared news, children brought stories from school. Folks came not to trade only goods, but to trade wisdom. There was a board nailed up near the entrance where people posted ideas, lessons, and sayings from the elders. Some were simple things like mend your fence before you mend your fortune, or a aimed word lasts longer than a seasoned yield. But every now and then, one of Elias' old phrases would show up, scrawled by hand, still traveling through generations like the man himself was whispering through time. It warmed my heart to know that a valley once carved by greed was now shaped by gratitude. But the truest test of any legacy comes when the winds turn rough, and sure enough, they did. One autumn, the river flooded worse than anyone could remember. Whole fields washed away, the granary half submerged, homes turned to matchwood. It was the kind of disaster that could break a town clean in two, but not this one. Jesse and the townsfolk didn't wait for help from outside. They organized themselves by sunrise. Every able hand, young and old, went to work. The school became a shelter, the mill a command post. They rationed grain with care, not greed. The families that lost everything were fed first. And when the river finally receded weeks later, the town hadn't fallen apart. It had grown stronger. That flood tested the mettle of their principles, and they didn't let pass, they proved. I remember sitting by the fire that winter, listening to the children laugh while Jesse spoke to a crowd gathering in the mill. He stood there with his hat off, his boots muddy, and said, "You can't stop storms from mumming, but you can choose how you'll stand through them. Wealth ain't safety from trouble. Get the courage to rebuild without losing faith." Those words spread like wildfire through the town, and soon after, they carved them right under the continuance plaque. It became a say that outlasted us all. When spring came, the valley was greener than then. Turns out, the flood had carried new soil down from the hills, making the land richer than before. It was like nature itself had rewarded their patience. The crops came in heavy that year, the grain sweet and plentiful, and Jesse, humble, said, "Seems the Lord compounding our interest." That got a good laugh from everyone, but deep down they knew it was true. The principles we'd lived by, slow growth, shared wealth, earned peace, they worked the same way the earth did. You give more than you take, tend what yours, and trust that what you plant with care, you multiply in time. That was the gospel of the valley. As my bones grew weaker, I spent more time watching than working. Jesse's children ran the mill now, and the children after them. I'd sit outside by the old cottonwood, the bark rough under my hand, and listen to the hum of life all around, the wheels turning, the horses trotting, the laughter of young folk who didn't know how hard won their peace had been. And that ignorance, that blessed innocence, was the sure sign of success. When you've built a world that your children don't have, to fight the same wars you did, that when you know you've truly struck gold. Sometimes travelers would still stop by, same as Jesse once had, wanderers with empty pockets and full hearts, chasing a dream they couldn't name. But townsfolk would feed them, let them rest, they give them work, and almost always one of them would. In them, sitting under that cottonwood, asking the same question Jesse had asked. The all them years age. What do you do when you ain't got nothing to start with? The answer, passed down from Elias to me, from me to Jesse, and from Jesse to every generation after, was always the same. You start with what no man can steal: time, attention, and patience. The rest follows. Funny thing is, by the time they'd hear it, the answer already lived in them. They just needed to be reminded. That's what stories are for, I reckon, not to teach something new, but to wake up what already true inside us. The valley became known far and wide for its fairness. Traders from the city said deals done then were worth twice as much at anywhere else, because every handshake and continuance was as good as a contract. Even in hard times, no man cheated and no woman went hungry. Their system wasn't built on trust, it was trust, and that made it unshaken. By the time my eyes dimmed too much to see, I could still feel that rhythm, the hum of a place that had learned how to breathe with the world instead of fight against it. And when I closed my eyes for the last time, I didn't see gold or ledgers or land. I saw the mill turning, the children laughing, the cottonwood leaning into the wind. I heard Elias' voice, soft as the rain. The rhythm of a man life should match the rhythm of the earth, slow, patient, and certain. That night that the rain began to fall, I smiled and let it carry me. The same rain that had once tested us now sang us to sleep. And if you listen close enough, maybe you'd still hear it, the sound of continuance humming eternal beneath the storm. After that long flood and the seasons that followed, life in the valley found a kind of rhythm that felt older than time itself. It was a peace that didn't come from silence, but from purpose. Every man, woman, and child knew their role in the steady hum of the land. The millstone turned, the children learned, the crops grew, and the rain came when it pleased. It was a balance born not of luck, but of lessons carried like heirlooms in the hearts of those who stayed. By then, Jesse had grown older. His beard had gone white, his back bent a bit, but his eyes still burned with that same quiet certainty. He'd sit on the porch where I once sat, hat tilted low, coffee in hand, watching the younger generation go about their work. And sometimes, when the dusk settled thick and the frogs began their nightly chorus, he'd tell stories about Elias, about the gold, about the long road that led dead. He never claimed to be a hero, never painted himself as a man of grand fortune. Instead, he said, I'd have stayed long enough to listen when the world was whispering what most men rush past. That line, like men of his, stuck. Soon enough, the townsfolk called it the Jesse way, a way of living measured not by what you gained, but by what you tended. A man's worth wasn't counted in acres or coin, but in steadiness, how well he could keep his word, care for his kin, and leave things a little better than he found them. One summer, a young man from the city rode into town. Name was Daniel, slick hair, sharp clothes, and eyes that glitter with ambition the way quicksilver etches life. He came with talk of expansion, progress, modernization, words that rolled smooth off his tongue but carried the chill of haste. Said he'd heard about continuance and thought it could be turned into a model of scalable wealth. Jesse just smiled at him, the kind of smile that had seen 1,000 versions of the same speech. They sat together on the porch, the young man talking fast, sketching numbers in the dirt with his boot heel. He spoke of machines that could double the output, of investors who'd bring opportunity, of markets that would unlock the valley untapped potential. When he finally paused for breath, Jesse looked him straight in the eye and said, Son, the moment you start counting what the land owes you instead of what you owe it, you've already gone broke. Daniel blinked, confused, maybe even a little offended. But sir, think of how much more you could make. Jesse chuckled, a sound rough with gravel. I've already made more than I needed. The land's still whole, profit enough. The boy didn't get it, and not then, but he stayed for a while out of curiosity, if not respect. Jesse put him to work in the mill, same way I once did with him. Daniel resisted at first, but over time the rhythm got into him. Their kind of honesty and labor that can scrub arrogance right out of a man's soul. He started slowing down, listening more, rushing less. When he left months later, he didn't take a wheel coin with it, just a small wooden token carved with the symbol of the mill. A circle split by a line, half daft, half light, balance. Word spread about that encounter, and years later, Daniel wrote to the valley from the city, said he'd started his own workshop running it the Jesse way, paid his workers fair, grew slow, invested in trust, and wouldn't you know it, he prospered. Not in the way city men brag about, but in the way men sleep easy at night. That's how the philosophy of continuity spread. Not through speeches or sermons, but through steady examples. Every person who passed through the valley carried a seed of it somewhere deep, and when they left, they planted it elsewhere. Before long, other towns began to adopt the same ways: slow trade, honest work, shared gain, the kind of economics no banker could draw up because it was built on the soil of human decency. Jesse didn't live to see just how far it reached, but I think he knew. Could sense it in the letters that arrived from distant places, in the visitors who came meet to thank him for showing what patience could yield. He'd read them out loud on stormy nights, voice low, almost reverent. Then he'd say, "Ain't it something, old man?" A handful of stories, a few lessons, and now they're growing like wild barley across the plains. And I'd answer him in my heart that how it's supposed to be, Jesse. Wealth that grows quiet, steady, unseen, like roots deep enough to outlast droughts. When Jesse passed, the valley didn't mourn with tears, they mourned with gratitude. For a week, the mill stopped turning, and the townsfolk there by the cottonwood, laying down tools and hats in respect. They buried him beside Elias, the river humming soft nearby, and carved words into the stone so simple and true they almost felt eternal. He turned toil into peace and patience into gold. Every night after, when the rain came, the sound it made against the tin roof seemed softer, like the sky itself had learned gentleness from the land below. And in that sound was the eft of everything the valley had become, not rich in glitter, but rich in grace. That whole continuance kept on thriving, not does of any one man, but does every man who came after remembered they passed down not rules, but rhythms. They didn't talk about growth, they lived it. Quietly, faithfully, the way the earth turns beneath the stars, never boasting, never stopping. And maybe that the greatest kind of fortune there is, to live in such harmony that when you're gone, the world doesn't notice a gap, only the edge of your footsteps carrying forward, gentle and sure as the rain. Long after Jesse passing, the valley carried his name like a quiet hymn made. Folks would speak of him the way a body speaks of the rain, natural, necessary, and full of life. The new generations never met him, yet somehow they have felt that they had. His words had settled deep into the rhythm of things, the way they measured their time, their work, even their silences. All of it bore the fingerprints of a man who'd once believed patience was more valuable than gold. By then, continuance had grown into more than a valley. There was a way of life that stretched beyond its borders, carried in letters, trade routes, and the wandering feet of dreamers. Travelers who came through always said the same thing: they're a calm meal you can find nowhere else. They couldn't name it, but the people of continuance knew it was the calm of shared purpose, of lives lived in tune with the earth, slow, steady song. A council of elders ran the town now, made up of men and women who'd learned under Jesse's watch. They weren't politicians or preachers, just farmers, carpenters, traders, and school teachers who believed that wealth was best weighed in harmony, not hierarchy. Every season, they'd meet under the old cottonwood to decide the future. No grand speeches, no fancy ledgers, just quiet conversation, honest votes, and the understanding that no one voice should et louder than the rest. One spring, a drought came longer and harsher than any before. The soil cracked, the crops withered, and the river shrank to a whisper of its old self. Some younger folks began to worry. They'd grown up in peace and prosperity, never knowing the taste of desperation. When a merchant from the city rode in with carts of grain promising salvation for a price, temptation hung heavy in the air. He was slick-tongued, with a smile that glittered like polished brass. Told them he could modernize their systems, lend them the capital to buy irrigation machines, guarantee prosperity. His words were sweet Ed molasses, and for a moment the crowd almost believed him. But then an old woman, Clara, one of the last who remembered Jesse, stood up and said, "Young man, we don't buy what we can build, and we don't sell what we can share." The merchant laughed. "And what'll you share when your fields are dust?" Clara smiled, that slow, knowing kind of smile born from too many seasons to be rattled by one. "Hope," she said, and hands always got plenty of those. And she was right. The town came together like a body healing itself. They dug deeper wells, rationed fairly, and reworked the irrigation ditches by hand. Families that still had water shared with those who didn't. The schoolhouse taught lessons by candlelight when the river couldn't turn the mill. And though the summer burned long and hot, not one soul starved. When the rains finally returned, The first drops hit the rooftops like the drumming of angels. The people stood outside laughing, crying, faces turned skyward. They didn't cheer for the rain itself. They cheered for what they'd proven again, that their wealth was in their unity, not their yield. The merchant had long since left by then, frustrated and confused. He couldn't understand how a town could turn down profit and still thrive. But the people of Confluence didn't need to explain it. Their answer was in the way the earth responded, how the valley bloomed twice so bright the next season, the soil richer for the hardship. Clara lived long enough to see that harvest, and on her final day, she sat beneath the cottonwood with her granddaughter Lila. The girl was curious, always asking questions about the old days. Grandma, she said, why don't we build more, bigger mills, bigger barns, more trade routes? Wouldn't that make us stronger? Clara chuckled, a low, warm sound. Child, strength ain't in the size of your shadow. It in how steady you stand when the light shifts. Jesse taught us that. Your great-granddad taught him. And one day, you'll teach someone else. Lila frowned. But how do I know what enough? Clara looked at the horizon. There the sun was melting into gold. When you can stop wanting more and start thanking the Lord for what already in your hands. That when you've got enough, those words stayed with Lila. When Clara passed, the townsfolk buried her beside the others, under the same cottonwood that had shaded Elias, me, and Jesse. Lila, barely 20, took her grandmother place on the council. She was young, but she had the same calm fire in her eyes. She'd grown up hearing the stories, and more importantly, she'd lived them. Under her guidance, Continuance took a new kind of step forward. Not one of expansion, but of education. She built a small library beside the school, filled with journals, ledgers, and letters from all who'd come before. It wasn't fancy, just shelves of hand-bound pages, inked by steady hands and humble minds. But those pages held something rare, the memory of a people who'd learned how to prosper without poisoning the soil that fed them. Travelers who visited would often find her there, reading by lamplight while the rain pattered against the windows. They'd ask her how such a small town could remain untouched by the chaos of the outside world. She'd smile, close her book, and answer, because we don't chase the wind. We let it pass and plant what it still. And so it went, generation after generation. The faces changed, the tools improved, but the heart of the valley beat the same. The cottonwood grew wider, its roots reaching deeper than any man could dig. It shaded graves and births alike. Yet when storms passed through, its leaves sang with a sound that could hush even the most restless soul. Some nights, when the rain fell steady and the fire crackled low, folks would still tell the story of the miner who stopped digging, the drifter who listened, the farmer who stayed, and the people who built a fortune slow as sunrise. And always, the telling ended the same way, in a whisper that carried through the dark. May your patience outlive your hunger, and may your hands find peace in the work with the prayer of continuance. The hymn of the valley, the song that never ends. Years passed, but the winds so wheat soft, constant, and full of stories that only time itself could tell. Continuance kept on thriving, not because it was shielded from the world chaos, but because it had learned how to stand still while the rest of the world ran itself ragged. Its people worked the same fields, turned the same river wheel, and sang the same quiet hymns of gratitude every dawn. Outside sometimes taught it old-fashioned, but they didn't understand. It wasn't behind the times, it had outlasted them. Lila grew into her role like a willow bending to the wind, graceful and unbreakable. She wasn't loud or proud, she led with patience, not pressure, and under her guidance the valley began to teach others, not through lectures or grand speeches, but through example. When merchants came with their contracts, they left with headshakes instead. When traders came with big promises, they found contentment more powerful than profit. Folks from far-off towns began to send their sons and daughters to learn the continuance way. One of them was a young man named Thomas Clay. He came from the eastern plains, where the soil was tired and the people more old. Years passed, with the winds of wheat soft, constant, and full of stories that only time itself could tell. Continuance kept on thriving, not because it was shielded from the world chaos, but because it had learned how to stand still while the rest of the world ran itself ragged. Its people worked the same fields, turned the same river wheel, and sang the same quiet hymns of gratitude every dawn. Outside sometimes taught it old-fashioned, but they didn't understand. It wasn't behind the times, it had outlasted them. Leela grew into a role like a willow bending to the wind, graceful and unbreakable. She wasn't loud or proud. She led with patience, not pressure. And under her guidance, the valley began to teach others, not through lectures or grand speeches, but through example. When merchants came with their contracts, they left with headshakes instead. When traders came with big promises, they found contentment more powerful than profit. Folks from far-off towns began to send their sons and daughters to learn the continuance way. One of them was a young man named Thomas Clay. He came from the eastern plains, where the soil was tired and the people more old. Years passed, with the winds a wheat soft, constant, and full of stories that only time itself could tell. Continuance kept on thriving, not because it was shielded from the world chaos, but because it had learned how to stand still while the rest of the world ran itself ragged. Its people worked the same fields, turned the same river wheel, and sang the same quiet hymns of gratitude every dawn. Outside sometimes taught it old-fashioned, but they didn't understand it wasn't behind the times it had outlasted them. Leela grew into a role like a willow bending to the wind, graceful and unbreakable. She wasn't loud or proud. She led with patience, not pressure. And under her guidance, the valley began to teach others, not through lectures or grand speeches, but through example. When merchants came with their contracts, they left with headshakes instead. When traders came with big promises, they found contentment more powerful than profit. Folks from far-off towns began to send their sons and daughters to learn the continuance way. Ingrown none watching his father rake his back for a yield that never paid enough to rest easy. When he arrived in continuance, he carried all the usual burdens, ambition, worry, and the quiet ache of someone who'd seen too much taken and not enough given. But he also carried curiosity. Lila took him under her wing. She taught him how to read the sky for weather, how to feel the weight of grain in his palm and know if the season was generous. But most of all, she taught him how to listen to the land, to people, to silence. At first, Thomas thought it was nonsense. "You mean to tell me," he said one afternoon, "that sitting quiet gonna feed my family?" Lila smiled, brushing soil from her hands. "No, Thomas, but it'll teach you how not to starve your soul while you're feeding him." That stuck with him. Weeks turned to months and he began to slow down. His sharp edges dulled into something steadier. Got pleased for that.
Started helping the elders rebuild the old irrigation channels. Learned how to weave rope from river reeds. He began keeping a small journal notes about how much water the crops drank, what birds sang before rain, what dreams came on nights when the wind changed direction. It was the first time he'd written something that wasn't for business. As the years rolled by, Thomas became one of the valley's strongest hands. He wasn't the fastest or the wealthiest, but he was dependable, which in continuance meant more than both. When Lila grew old, she named him her successor, not because he was perfect, but because he understood that perfection had never been the goal. She told him, "Don't build taller walls, Thomas. Build longer tables." That's just what he did. Under Thomas' watch, continuance became a place where travelers stayed longer, not just for trade, but for rest. Some came broken farmers who'd lost everything to drought, merchants bankrupted by greed, families scattered by the noise of the modern world.
Thomas welcomed them. "You can't fix a man hunger," he'd say, "but you can feed him while he remembers how to stand in." One winter night, a storm rolled through fierce and cold. Lightning split the sky, and the river swelled with fury. The people huddled in their homes, praying for the old mill not to rake. Thomas stood watch by the riverbank, lantern in hand, boots sunk in mud. He watched the water rise inch by inch, threatening to swallow what they'd built, but instead of panicking, he began to hum a tune passed down since Jesse time, the old hymn of the valley. Soon others joined him. Men and women stepped out with ropes and shovels, voices carrying through the storm. They reinforced the levees, tied the mill wheel down, and worked till dawn. When the sun broke through the clouds, the river had calmed, and the town still stood. Exhausted, drenched, and covered in mud, the people of continuance laughed through tears. Not one building lost, not one soul gone. It was another test they'd passed together, another storm weather not with money, but with faith and community. That night, they sat round fires, drying their boots. Thomas spoke words that would etch for generations. He said, "There'll always be floods, always be storms. The trick ain't stopping rim. It's remembering what keeps you upright when they come. Patience, gratitude, work done with love, that are real fortune." And in that moment, rain dripped gently from the eaves. Every soul there understood what it meant to be rich, not in coin nor in comfort, but in kenya, endurance, and the kind of peace that can't be bought or sold. Thomas lived a long life, and when he grew too old to work the fields, he became the valley storyteller. Children gathered round him each evening. 80 told tales of Elias, Jesse, Clara, and Lila. each one a verse in the never-ending song of continuance. His voice cracked with age, but it carried the warmth of generations past. Sometimes he'd stop mid-story, gaze into the fire, and whisper, "Ain't it something? Fine. How patience can outlive us all." The children didn't always understand the weight of those words, but they remembered the tone, the feeling, the rhythm, and that was enough. Because in continuance, wisdom wasn't stored in books or monuments. It was planted in hearts, passed from story to story, like embers carrying light through the dark. When Thomas passed, the valley didn't fall silent. It sang, not with voices, but with life itself. The rustle of leaves, the turning of the mill, the laughter of children echoing through the vain hills that once held nothing but ambition. The same wind that carried away the dust of greed now carried the whisper of legacy. In that whisper, softer rain on tin, was a truth that no time could erode. The richest man is the one who leaves behind more peace than he found. Long after Thomas Clay passing, his name lived not on plaques or in ledgers, but in the breath of the people who still spoke of him beneath that same cottonwood. They called him the bridge man, not for anything he built from stone or timber, but for what he'd connected in the hearts of those who came after. It was said that Thomas didn't just keep the valley alive, he made it listen again. His stories had a way of lingering, curling into the cracks of memory, like campfire smoke that refuses to leave your clothes. Years later, a boy named Samuel grew up hearing those stories. His mother told them to him before bed, his grandfather recited them by the fire, and the elders used them in lessons during winter gatherings. But Samuel wasn't content with just hearing the stories. He wanted to see what lay beyond the valley, to find out if the rest of the world remembered the wisdom that had kept Tenuant standing for nearly a century. He had that restless spark, same one Jesse once had, before the land taught him patience. Except Samuel's restlessness wasn't born of greed, it was born of wonder. He was 19 when he left, pack slung over his shoulder, carrying with him nothing but a few keepsakes, a carved wooden token of balance, a journal of Thomas Clay sayings, and a small vial of earth from the valley heart. He said goodbye at dawn, and the whole town vowed to see him off. Lila, granddaughter, now gay-haired herself, placed her hand on his shoulder and said, "Don't forget where silence comes from, Sammy. Out there it'll be louder than thunder, but you'll hear us in the quiet." And so he went, down the old trade roads and into the world beyond. What he found wasn't evil, but empty. The cities glimmered like stars fallen to the ground, full of movement, full of sound, but hollow where it mattered. Men chased fortunes that slipped through their fingers faster than water through cracked clay. They built towers of steel and glass that caught the sunrise but cast shadows longer than hope. Samuel saw people toil without pause, working not to live but to prove they existed. He saw children of wealth who owned the sky yet never stopped looking down. For a while it broke him a little inside. He tried speaking the ways of continuance to them, told them about Jesse Patience, Clara Calm, Lila Balance, Thomas Song. But they just smiled politely, or sometimes laughed, thinking he was some cunt boy lost in a world too fast for him. That might work where you're from, they'd say, but out there, time is money. Samuel would nod, knowing they'd missed the truth entirely. Time was the money, and they were spending it faster than they could earn peace. Still, he didn't give up. Instead of preaching, he started showing. He worked tend a farmhand on the outskirts of a city called Meridian. The soil there was tired, geared, and treated like a tool rather than a living thing. The farm owner, a man named Everett Brand, was kind but burdening. His debts were heavy, his patience thin, and his fields gave less each season. Samuel asked him one evening if he could try something different, an old planting pattern he'd learned from home. Everett laughed at first. "Son, I've been farming since before you were born." That was Samuel smiled. "Then you'll know a good idea when it works." Everett shrugged. Let him have one small plot of land. Samuel worked it alone, turned the soil with care, mixed in compost instead of chemicals, rotated the crops that the elders had taught. And every morning, he'd hum while he worked. The workers thought that strange, but the sound drew a kind of peace into the air. The wind seemed to blow softer there, and birds started landing again where they hadn't in years. By the end of the season, that little plot outgrew every other field. The soil had come back to life. The stalks stood taller, the fruit richer, the earth softer. Everett couldn't believe it. He walked through the rows one dawn, dirt between his fingers, muttering, all this from patience? Samuel nodded. Patience and gratitude. Every handful of soil a partner, not a servant. You treat it right, it'll feed you forever. Word spread quick. Other farmers came to see the boy who made the dirt sing again. Samuel didn't charge a fee or write a book. He just taught whoever asked, showed them how to listen to the land rhythm, to slow their plows, to rest their fields between seasons. They thought it was new science. Samuel knew it was old wisdom, just forgotten under layers of noise. Before long, Everett's struggling farm became a refuge for those who'd lost theirs. Families came from miles away, drawn not by wealth, but by the quiet sense of hope that seemed to grow there. They called it the Still Acre, and it became something rare, a place where hard work and harmony walked side by side. But Samuel didn't stay forever. Once the land was strong again, he felt the pull of the horizon calling him home. Before he left, Everett handed him a ledger. Inside were the names of every family he'd helped, each with a note beside it. Paid in patience. Samuel smiled. This ledger worth more than gold. Everett chuckled. Then it belongs where gold means less than good. Samuel carried that ledger back to continuance. With time had moved out the river slope, sure and full of memory. When he returned, the valley didn't look different. The cottonwood still stood, the mill still turned, and the people still there at dusk to tell stories. Only thing that tamed was the number of stars in their sky, brighter somehow, as though the world had decided to shine a little stronger over the one place that never stopped believing in balance. Shared what he'd learned, but what moved the people most wasn't the success, it was the way he brought the world back with him. His journey proved what they'd always hoped, that even in a world gone restless, patience could still win, that slow, honest work could heal what greed had broken, that a valley truth could ripple across ocean, cities, and hearts and still return home intact. That night, under the soft hum of rain, Samuel stood by the cottonwood and read aloud from Everett Ledger. Each name was a prayer, each line a story, each note a promise kept between the living and the land. And when he finished, the people didn't clap, they just listened to the rain, as though heaven itself was nodding along. As the seasons turned, Samuel became something of a legend himself, not because he sought fame, but because stories had a way of sprouting wherever kindness took root. The valley had known many teachers before him, but none quite like this soft-spoken wanderer who'd returned home carrying more than wisdom. He carried proof. Proof that the world out, for all its noise and confusion, could still be touched by the same quiet truths the people of continuance had lived by for generations. He settled back into the rhythm of the land, building a small home near the old river bend where Jesse once set up his mill. The walls were simple, the floor creaked with comfort, and a low porch stretched wide enough for sitting through summer storms. Each evening, Samuel would light his lantern and open Everett Ledger, reading it by the crackle of firewood. Sometimes children from town would come knocking, asking to hear another story. He never refused. A good story, he'd say, ain't meant to be owned, it meant to keep folks warm. In time, he started teaching in the little schoolhouse, though he never called himself a teacher. He said he was just an ant who'd seen enough mistakes to know where the ruts are. His lessons weren't written on chalkboards, they were drawn in dirt, whispered over seed rows, and traced in river water. He taught the children in numbers feel the pattern of rainfall, patience through the growth of saplings, and gratitude through the taste of fresh bread made by shared effort. It wasn't long before outsiders began visiting continents again, journalists, traders, even scholars. They'd heard whispers of a valley that defied the world rush, made the people live well without taking too much. Some came to learn, others to exploit, but all left changed. Samuel would greet them the same way. A quiet nod, a place by the fire, and a question before any answer. What got you running? That question stopped many in their tracks. For in a world built on motion, few were thought to ask why they were moving. Some answered with ambition, others with fear. But after a few days in the valley, after they'd walked its slow roads, tasted its simple meals, and listened to the songs sung in dusk, they began to understand what Samuel and his people already knew. Speed ain't the same in progress, and comfort ain't the same in peace. One visitor, a city banker named Rowe, stayed longer than most. He'd arrived wearing a suit too fine for the dust, and eyes too tired for the light. Samuel found him sitting by the river one morning, staring at his reflection, though waiting for it to blink first. "You looking for something out there?" Samuel asked. Rose sighed. "Maybe what I lost somewhere along the way. Used to think success would feel like rest. But every time I hit a goal, I just feel smaller." Samuel nodded. That cause you're climbing ladders built by men who don't know what they leave. You can't find rest up there. It only found way. Things grow slow. Roe chuckled bitterly. And what? Start farm men? I wouldn't know one end of a plow from the other. Don't need to, Samuel said. Just need to remember that life don't owe you nothing but time. And what you do with it decides if you're rich or poor. Those words burrowed deep. Roe stayed for 3 months, helped mend fences, hauled water, learned to listen to the wind. When he left, he carried not gold nor goods, but a handful of seeds wrapped in cloth. For the garden behind my home, he said, to remind you to wait, and wait he did. Years later, word came that he'd built a community garden across the city, teaching families how to grow food, not for profit, but for pride. Samuel George smiled when he heard, "Guess the seeds found good soil," he murmured. As time went on, Samuel Beardgate, his steps slowed, but his eyes never dimmed. He often said he didn't measure his life by years, but by seasons. Each one, he'd tell the children, leave something behind. Don't rush them or you'll miss what they're giving you. He'd sit under the cottonwood, letting the leaves fall upon him like blessings, each one a whisper of those who came before Elias, Jesse, Clara, Leela, Thomas. Their names weren't carved into stone. They were carried in stories sewn in hearts and echoed in the very hum of the valley.
Born out of evening storm rolled in soft thunder, the time that comforts more than fright. Samuel sat by his fire, journal open, pen resting beside a cup of tea gone cold.
Huh? It wasn't writing about wealth or legacy, but about stillness. The longer I live, he wrote, the more I see that the world don't need more builders or bankers. It needs rememberers, folks who remember that time itself is the treasure, and peace is as you spend it. He closed his book, looked out the window, and smiled. The rain came steady, tapping gentle against the glass. The mill wheel creaked softly in the distance, and the river, full and alive, whispered the same tune it had whispered since long before any man had found it. Samuel leaned back, eyes heavy, breath even. Some say he drifted into sleep right there, warm and content. Others say he passed on, quietly a sigh, carried off by the same peace he'd spent his life protecting. Maybe both are true. The next morning, the townsfolk found his lamp still burning. The ledger sat open on his table, a new line ink in his steady hand. Wealth is not in what we keep, but in what we continue. They buried him beside the cottonwood next to the others. The people didn't mourn with wails or sermons. They just stood tethered, hands clanked, heads bowed, while the rain fell like a hymn. A child placed his worn ledger atop the grave, letting the ink wash slightly in the rain, like the words themselves were returning to the soil that raised them. That night, the valley sang again, not with voices, but with the wind. It hummed through the mill, whispered through the fields, and danced in the cottonwood leaves. The sound was familiar, eternal, alive. Some said it was Samuel Breath joining the valley song. Others just taught it what it was, the music of patience, carrying on. And so it did. Always will. Years rolled on, and though faces sached and generations traded places, continuance never lost the hum of its steady heart. The world outside had gone and spun itself into a frenzy again. Machines replaced men, chatter replaced silence, and fortunes rose and fell faster than thunder in a summer storm. But the valley still moved to the rhythm of patience. It was not untouched by the times. No, even continuance had its share of modern contraptions. But somehow, they'd managed to make progress fit instead of letting it take over. The new blended with the old like rain, water, blending the river different, but never at odds. There was a girl born a few winters after Samuel passed, name of June Clay, kin by blood and spirit. Folks said she had her grandfather's still eyes and her great-grandmother quiet fire. Even as a child, she'd wander off to the riverbank, listening to its whisper like it was telling her secrets. The elders let her be, knowing the valley raised its own that way, through silence and sky, not lectures or rules. By the time she was grown, June had a mind sharp beat spring air. She could fix a plow, read the stars, and balance a ledger without losing a smile. But she also had questions the older folks didn't always know how to answer. Why, she asked one evening, sitting under the cottonwood, do we keep our valley stories here? Don't they deserve to be heard out there too? Old Marin, who'd been Samuel's student long ago, chuckled through his gay beard. World out there ain't always ready for truth told slow, child. June tilted her head, then maybe it just needs someone patient enough to tell it. That was how her journey began, not with a departure, but with a decision. She wasn't like Samuel. She didn't go looking for something. She went to give something. Her red was simple: bring the lessons of continuance to the rest of the world, one story at a time, not through speeches or business, but through the thing her people had always done best, living right and letting others see it. She started small, traveling to nearby towns, helping fix what folks thought was broken but really just forgotten.
She showed one town how to rotate their crops to heal the soil, taught another how to run a co-op market where no one went hungry. In cities, she spoke to students and dreamers about slow building, how real success grows lick-and-oak. Unseen roots first, then branches. Some mocked her, calling her ideas outdated, but others listened, and in those eyes, she saw the same hunger Samuel once saw, the hunger not for more, but for enough. As months turned to years, June became known as the woman who plants calm. She'd leave towns changed not by revolution, but by rhythm. After she left, people worked different, spoke softer, smiled longer. Something about her way had a gravity to it, like she carried the valley peace in her pocket and let it spill where it was needed. She kept a small notebook, leather-bound and worn from travel. Inside she wrote reflections, bits of wisdom led along her path. One entry read, "Money feeds the mouth, patience feeds the world." Another said, "Progress without purpose is just movement without music." They weren't commandments, just gentle reminders, the kind that sound like a friend advice whispered beside a fire.
On one of her journeys, she reached a city so large it seemed to swallow the sky. Noise filled every corner, and the air shimmered with ambition. It was a place that had forgotten how to breathe. June stayed a while, listening, watching. She saw people chase clocks instead of sunsets, argue over profit while letting kindness rust. So she did what came natural. She started a little garden on the roof of her inn. Nothing grand, but herbs and greens. Within weeks, the smell drew curious neighbors. She shared what she grew, not for money, but for conversation. Those talks became small gatherings, and those gatherings became quiet lessons in simplicity. Soon, that roof became a refuge, a place where office clerks, builders, and teachers came to rest their bones and remember how to be still. They'd talk about life, not work, but gratitude, not gain. June never lectured, she just asked questions, gentle ones that made folks look inward. "Would you trade your peace for day?" she'd ask, and let silence do the rest. When she finally left that city, she didn't take any with her, but she left something behind. Years later, that same rooftop garden had grown into a full community project, feeding hundreds and teaching thousands. Folks called it the Clay Foundation. Though June never claimed it, she'd already moved on to the next town, her boots muddy and her heart light. In time she returned home, her hair streaked with silver, her voice rich with travel and truth. The valley welcomed her with open arms and familiar quiet. She stood beneath the cottonwood, laying her notebook beside Samuel Ledger, whispering, "Your patience made me brave." Then he smiled and added a final note to her book. "Every good seed takes longer than we deck, but shorter than forever." The people of Continuance danced that evening to hear her tales. They didn't clap when she finished, just sat still, eyes glimmering in firelight, breathing in the peace she carried back. And in that stillness, the river sang the same tune it always had, one that carried through time like a promise kept. And maybe, just maybe, if you listen real close on a quiet night when the rain tapping soft against your window and the world outside has gone to sleep, you'll hear that same hum, not from the wind nor the earth, but from the patience that outlives us all. A melody of balance, of gratitude, of living slow and steady in a world that forgot how. Because the real riches, as every Clay learned, ain't in what you build or buy, they're in what you remember to love. As time pressed forward, the lessons of continuance began spreading beyond borders, carried not by preachers or businessmen, but by whispers, by stories told in kitchens, classrooms, and long walks home. Folks didn't even know where the words came from. Phrases like "the soil remembers kindness" or "don't count the harvest before you feel the rain" started slipping into everyday talk like old proverbs that had never needed writing. Maybe that's how truth travels best, quietly, without a name attached, finding its way into the hearts that need it most. One particular winter, a young drifter by the name of Owen stopped by the valley, drawn by the kind of curiosity that only the lost seemed to carry. He was a boy of 20, with a sort of tired in his eyes that shouldn't belong to someone so young. His boots were worn thin, his hands rough from work that never paid enough, and he spoke with the hesitance of a man who'd been scolded one too many times for dreaming. When he came upon the village, the snow was falling light and the world felt hushed, that even time was holding its breath. June, now older but still steady, found him sitting by the frozen river, staring at the cottonwood tree. And he went on something, she asked. He blinked, caught off guard. Guess I was hoping it'd talk back, he said with a half smile. June chuckled softly. It will, in its own way. The trick is being quiet long enough to hear. Over the next few days, Owen stayed. He helped mend fences, shoveled snow, and shared meals at the community table. Didn't speak much about where he came from, only said he'd been chasing work from town to town, never staying long enough to call anywhere home. Money come fast, leaves faster, he muttered one night by the fire. Feels like I'm digging wells in sand. June handed him a mug of coffee, warm and simple. You can't fill a life by chasing emptiness, she said. You fill it by waiting with purpose. That struck him deep, though he didn't say so. He stayed on through spring, learning the valley ways. The people of Cantuance didn't push him. They let him settle at his own rhythm. He worked the fields, helped at the mill, and found something he hadn't felt in years, rest that didn't come from exhaustion. What changed him wasn't a single moment, but the slow accumulation of them, the way folks greeted each sunrise without hurry, the laughter that came easy without drink, the trust that didn't need contracts or signatures. He realized that this place, for all its quiet, carried more wealth than the richest city, and for the first time in his life he wondered if he'd been running not toward something but away from it. When summer came, June asked him if he planned to keep moving. He stared at the horizon, then at the cottonwood swaying easy in the wind. Used to think leaving meant living, he said, but now I figure staying might be braver. June smiled that knowing smile of hers. Ain't about staying or leaving, son. It's about rooting. Wherever you end up, make sure your soul don't drift. Oh, and you point to heart. He did stay for a time long enough to learn the art of patient work. He got to carpentry, mending the old bridge that crossed the river, the same one Thomas Clay once walked years Eve. The planks had grown weary, the nails rusted, but under Owen Care it came back strong, steady and proud. When he finished, he carved a single phrase into its beam, built to last slow. That bridge became more than a crossing. It became a symbol of renewal, of the old ways finding new hands. Travelers who passed through often stopped, touching the carved letters like it was Ed's sort of blessing. Maybe it was. Years later, when Owen finally left, he didn't take much. Just a bag, his tools, and a little jar of soil from the valley, just like Samuel once had. He told June he wanted to see the world, not to chase it, but to understand it. There are too many folks out there running on fumes, he said. Maybe they didn't need a reminder of what a real breath feels like. June clasped his shoulder. Then take our wind with you, boy. Let it blow where it needed. Owen did that. He traveled far, worked docks in coastal towns, repaired barns in prairie lands, even built shelters in cities that had forgotten how to pause. Wherever he went, he left behind pieces of continuance, not in speeches or sermons, but in the things he built. Porches that invited sitting, gardens that asked for patience, benches that faced the sunrise instead of the street. Folks would ask him where he learned to build like that. He'd just grin and say, a quiet place taught to. The legend of continuance grew, not that a myth, but that a movement. Small towns started forming cooperatives. Farmers began trading labor instead of debt. And even in the cities, people led once a week to share food without talking business. They called it clay time, though no one could trace where the name came from. It didn't matter. What mattered was that people were remembering Van. Remembering that wealth wasn't without ownership, but stewardship. Back in the valley, June grew older. Her hair turned to snow. She spent her days sitting under the cottonwood, reading from Samuel Ledger and her own journal. Children would gather around her feet the same way they once had with Samuel, and she'd tell them the stories that began before any of them were born. The world, she'd say, ain't broken. It's just hurrying. All we're doing here is reminding it to slow down. And when she finally passed, and gentle as twilight itself, they buried her right beside Samuel, under the roots of the cottonwood that had shaded every generation of their kin. The people placed her notebook beside his ledger, binding the stories together, two voices in harmony humming across time. The rain came that night, steady and sure, like applause from heaven itself. And when morning rose, the air smelled clean again, and the bridge stood firm, the mill wheel turned, and the valley sang. Somewhere in that hum, if you listened real close, you could hear all of them. The Clays, the farmers, the wanderers, each whispering the same simple truth. The world turns fast enough, your heart don't have to. When word of June and Owen work drifted through the world, it didn't come wrapped in headlines or shouted through markets. It came the way good rain travels quietly, gently, but steady enough to change the shape of dry ground. A generation rose that had never met a Clay by name. yet they spoke in her sayings, built by his hands, lived by the rhythm of a town they'd never seen. The spirit of continuance had seeped into the cracks of the restless world, patience moss reclaiming stone. In the farthest city to the east, the glass towers glimmered against the smog. A young woman named Ada worked in a firm that measured everything in numbers and nothing in meaning. She'd grown up in noise screens, clocks, constant motion, and though her wallet was thick, her days were hollow. One evening, after a deal went through that would close a small farm in favor of another skyscraper, she walked home through the rain and stopped beneath a poster past Ted on a lamp. It showed a wooden bridge, half leveled by sunrise, and beneath it, in simple script, built to last slow. The words clung to her long after the paper blurred from the drizzle. She didn't know why, but they made her chest ache in a way that felt like memory. That night, she searched for the phrase, found not a company or a slogan, but a story, a thread of names stretching back through decades. Samuel, June, Owen, and a place that continuance. No glossy website, no sponsors, just tales shared by travelers and wanderers who'd stayed long enough to listen. It was all word of mouth, yet it read like scripture. Ada took leave from her job that very month. Her co-workers laughed, calling her foolish for chasing some ghost town dream. She smiled anyway. Maybe a dream was what the world needed dosed. The journey took her weeks. She rode trains until the tracks ended, buses until the roads thinned to gravel, and finally walked the last miles through a stretch of quiet hills. When she reached continuance, the air felt heavier but clean, as though it had been filtered through honesty. The fields shimmered gold in the late afternoon sun, the river hummed like an old song, and the cottonwoods stood tall, branches open like a welcome. The people greeted her not with suspicion, but with nods and calm smiles that said, "We've been expecting you without expecting you." They offered her soup, bread, a place by the fire. She stayed a night, then another, until her watch stopped mattering and her breathing matched the pace of the wind. The days there stretched wide and full, even silence seemed to carry weight. No one talked about success the way she'd known it. They talked about continuing, about belonging, about doing things worth their slowness. It was during her second week that they found the ledgers, the old journals kept in a small library near the mill, bound in leather, pages yellowed and soft at the edges. One bore Samuel's name, another June, and several newer ones filled by townsfolk over the years. They weren't written like diaries, but conversations between time itself. Notes about planting, reflections on patience, sketches of bridges and rivers, even poems about the hum of stillness. She turned one page and found a line she never forgot. "You can't own peace. You can only share its sea." Something shifted inside her that day. All the deals she'd made, the cities she'd conquered, they suddenly felt small, like echoes of someone else's voice. Here, people weren't fighting to be first, they were learning to arrive together. She began helping Beji could mending fences, teaching children letters, organizing books in the library. Every sunset, she'd sit under the cottonwood with the others, listening the valley turn gold. For the first time, she wasn't counting minutes, she was collecting moments. Months passed, and when the leaves began to fall again, Ada knew she couldn't stay forever. Continuance wasn't meant to keep people. It was meant to teach them how to carry its quiet wherever they went. Before she left, she asked the eldest of the town, a man named Eli Marin's grandson, what she should take with her. He smiled slow, what Marin seemed to do. "Don't take from Mir," he said. "Take with." They're a difference. From empties the place, with keeps it alive. Ada filled a small notebook, not with instructions, but with feelings. What the rain sounded dug on the roof of the mill, how bread smelled when shared between strangers, how silence could be louder than applause. She titled it The Ledger of Light Things. When she left, the townsfolk waved not goodbye, but see you later, if they knew she'd become another voice in their echo. Back in the city, Ada didn't return to her old life. She rented a small shop front and turned it into a listening room. No loud music, no drinks, just chairs, books, and the steady sound of rain she piped through an old speaker. People came out of curiosity at first, then habet. They'd sit, breathe, and sometimes cry. On the wall above the door, she hung a single wooden sign, Continuance. The idea spread faster than she expected. Soon, there were listening rooms in other cities, quiet spaces for those who'd forgotten how to hear their own thoughts. Folks shared the story behind it, passing it down like fire in the dark. And though the world kept changing, the hum of the valley kept humming through them all. Years later, when Ada herself grew old, she made one final trip back to the valley. The cottonwood was still there, older but alive, its branches heavy with years. She placed her notebook beside the others and whispered, "Thank you for teaching me to wait." Then they sat beneath its shade until dusk, when the air turned soft and the first stars blinked awake. They say that night the wind carried her words across the fields, over rivers, through towns and cities, soft our breath, drawn in time. And in its wake, people everywhere paused, if only for a moment, to listen. Some didn't know why, but maybe that's the point. Maybe peace doesn't need to be understood. It just needs to be remembered. And if you close your eyes on a night when the rain falls slow and the fire crackles low, you might hear it too. That same old hum, steady and endless, whispering across the years, built to last slow. As the decades deepened and the world kept changing faster than a tumbleweed in a storm, the stories of Kent Hewitt still found their way into hearts that had never seen its hills or felt its slow rain. They were told in different tongues now, printed on pages and whispered in classrooms, tucked inside podcasts played by city folk who'd never owned a pair of boots. Yet the truth in those words didn't fade. It ripened. Like old whiskey, it got smoother with age, easier to swallow for those tired of the harsh burn of the modern chase. Far beyond the borders of that quiet valley, a man named Henry Ross carried the next spark. He wasn't a farmer nor a preacher, just a craftsman who built clocks in a small mountain town 2 countries over. His work was precise, his hours long, and his customers wealthy enough to demand perfection down to the second. But lately, he'd started to hate the sound of ticking. It reminded him too much of how little life he felt inside his own. One evening, after closing shop, Henry wandered into a roadside diner. There, an old traveler sat by the window, coat worn to threads, eyes bright, fade candlelight. The stranger was humming softly, tune mead but steady, a sound that somehow made the whole place quieter. They struck up a conversation, and somewhere between stories of weather and work, Henry confessed his unrest, the feeling that all his skill built nothing that lasted. The old man nodded slowly. "You'll build something that don't measure time but honors it." Henry frowned. "And I'd have the same thing?" The traveler smiled. "No, son. One counts the seconds, the other keeps him company." When Henry looked puzzled, the stranger pulled from his sachet a small wooden carving, a bridge worn smooth by touch. "It was made by a man who learned that lesson long before you or me," he said, setting it on the counter. "They called him Owen, said he built to last slow." That phrase settled deep into Henry's bones, like a seed dropped in waiting soil. When the stranger left, he didn't even notice the carving missing from the counter until hours later. He kept it by his workbench from that day on, right where the light hit it each morning. Weeks passed before Henry acted on that quiet tug. One night, while listening to the rain, he stopped winding one of his clocks and just watched it. For the first time, he saw not precision, but impatience. All those gears spinning, chasing each other endlessly for no reason other than motion itself. He took it apart piece by piece and began to build something new, something slower, quieter, truer. He called it the continuance clock. Instead of sets, it rocked seasons. Its pendulum swung only once every hour, and its hands moved so gently you had to sit still to notice. At the base, he carved the same words Owen had built to last slow. It wasn't meant to tell time, it was meant to remind people how much of it they already had. When Henry unveiled it at the town square, folks didn't know what to make of it. Some called it useless, others called it genius. But one old woman stood for a long time before it, tears shining in her eyes. "It don't rush it," she whispered. "It waits." That clock became a fixture of the town, a place people met, argued, proposed, prayed, and pondered. Children grew up marking their days by its slow rhythm, learning patience the way others learned arithmetic. The valley lesson had taken root again in a new soil. Years later, scholars would write about the continuance clock. It's a marvel of human-centered design. But those who lived near it knew better. It wasn't a marvel, it was a mirror. And when Henry died, his workshop became a gathering place for dreamers who'd grown weary of racing the tick. They came to study the mechanics, yes, but mostly to breathe in that quiet hum he'd built into its heart. Some took the idea further. A group of young architects began building slow schools. Mate's lessons unfolded with the seasons instead of semesters. A musician wrote an album inspired by the clock rhythm, songs so long and soft they lulled people into thought instead of excitement. Even a few business folk, tired of burnouts and boardrooms, started foundations rooted in the same idea: sustainable pace, honest growth, shared wealth. By the time a century had turned, the world had split between those who ran and those who remembered. And in the remembering places, you could still hear it, that hum, that river, that patient rhythm born of the clays and carried by every soul that found peace in stillness. There's a story that says one of Henry Clock's ended, and if the boy, gentle and slow, he like being that as subtle. No Ada Clay in her sitting there. They sat it beneath the cottonwood tree, right beside the old bridge. The hands turned slow. The pendulum whispered soft, and the valley, already timeless, smiled at the gift. One night fell the stars reflected in the river like sparks of memory. The wind shifted through the branches and carried the one steady sound, the tick that wasn't a tick but a heartbeat stretched across generations. And if you'd stood there, boots in the dirt, hands in your pockets, you'd have felt it too. That truth older than the first harvest and stronger than the last storm. That patience ain't about waiting, it's about trusting. Trusting that everything meant to last already knows how. They say time's an ugly way of circling back around like a river that forgets it already passed this bend before. And in those later years, long after Henry Ross' clock had taken root beneath that cottonwood, the world outside had started to roar again. Faster, hungrier. Machines that spoke in numbers, replaced voices that once told stories, screen filled with color, while fields emptied of people. But even then, the hum of continuance endured. Not rebellion, just as remembrance. For every city that burned too bright, there was a flicker somewhere quiet that burned steady. One of those flickers lived in a young boy named Eli Ward. Born in a far-off coastal town that barely slept, Eli grew up to the sound of traffic and tides. His mother a nurse, his father a fisherman who rarely returned home sober or soon. Between the sea tantrums and the city noise, peace was a thing he didn't believe existed. Not really, but when he was 10, his mother gave him an old book she'd found at a thrift store. The leather was cracked, the ink faded, but inside was a name he'd never forget. The Ledger of Light Thing. At first, he didn't understand half the words. They were written soft in slow sentences that felt like walking barefoot through mud, strange, patient, honest. But one night when his father's anger rattled the walls and the rain drowned out every sound, Eli opened it again, read the line that would vow him his whole life. You can't own peace, you can share its seat. Something in him stilled. He didn't know what it meant yet, but he felt it like a warmth that didn't come from fire. He carried that book through every storm after. When he was 17 and left home to chase work in the mainland, it was the one thing he packed first. The world he found was wide and wired, filled with folks running faster than their hearts could beat. He tried to keep up, took jobs in factories, on docks and warehouses where light never changed and clocks never stopped. The noise filled his days but not his soul. And every night before sleep, he'd open that same ledger and trace his fingers over the faded words until he remembered to breathe. Years went by and Eli learned how to fix things, machines, engines, broken doors, broken people. His hands became strong, his back bent a little. His voice grew quiet like a man who'd listened too long to the wrong kind of noise. But one winter night, when the company he worked for laid off half its crew without warning, something inside him snapped. Not in anger, but in understanding. He didn't want to build things that made life faster anymore. He wanted to build things that made it worth slowing down. He sold what little he owned, packed his tools and followed the map his mother had drawn before she passed, the one she said led to a place that the world still breathes right. It took him weeks, just like it had 80 years old. And when he reached the valley, it was like walking into a memory he hadn't lived yet. The air hummed, the grass swayed, and the cottonwood stood watch like a guardian of patience itself. The people welcomed him the same way they'd always welcomed wanderers, with soup, a smile, and silence that didn't feel empty. He stayed, of course. How could he not? He fixed roofs, oiled the mill wheel, and sat by the fire listening to stories older than the stars. And when he showed them the ledger, an old woman gasped softly and said that there was Ada, been gone near a century, that one. Funny how it found its way back. Eli stayed through spring, summer, and harvest. He watched the way the people worked, not hurried, not lazy, but balanced. He helped repair the bridge that still bore Owen carving, its letters smoothed by generations of hands. At night, he'd listen to the hum of the clock Henry built, its slow rhythm echoing across the valley like a heartbeat meant for the earth itself. Then one evening, sitting under the cottonwood, Eli started writing. He was not sure why. Maybe it was habit, maybe it was duty. He wrote about what he'd seen, what he'd felt, what the valley taught without speaking. He wrote about people who'd traded gold for quiet, about how the smallest kindness was a form of wealth, about how stillness wasn't absence, it was depth. When he finished, he looked at the old ledgers in the library and set his pages beside them, labeling the cover The Quiet Trade. That book didn't stay still long. Travelers copied it, shared it, read it by firelight and under street lamps. It reached corners of the world that had forgotten how to listen. Some mocked it, had worshipped it, but most simply felt it. Within a few years, New Woods entered the language of dreamers, the quiet trade, the act of giving more peace than you take. Communities began springing up, Genslow towns they call them. Folks left the city grind, build in places where work, rest, and soul moved together. They weren't perfect, no place is, but they were real. Markets where everything was handmade and time didn't cost extra. Cafes where you paid not for speed, but for stillness. Workshops where clocks ticked steady breaths. And children learned patience by planting seeds instead of swiping screens. Eli never saw himself as the founder of anything. He just smiled when people thanked him, always saying the same thing. I didn't make this, it'd been men a long while. I just remembered where to look. When he passed, they buried him beneath the cottonwood, near June and Samuel and the others who'd taught the world that progress ain't worth much without peace. And on his gravestone, carved clean and simple, were the words he'd written that first night in the valley. You can't own peace, you can only share its seek. And that's how it goes, even now, across the years and through the rain. Somewhere, there's always a small fire burning, a clock ticking soft, and a voice by the embers telling the story of a place where people learn to build, slow to breathe honest, and to live rich in quiet. Continuance never died because it never had to. It just kept humming steady as the wind that rustles through time, reminding us all that patience, like love, don't vanish. It simply waits for us to notice again. They say when the rains come to continuance, they don't just water the land, they wake the memories buried beneath it. And in those long, soft nights when thunder rolled far beyond the mountains and the air smelled of wet cedar, folks still fed around the fire, same as always, old men, young dreamers, weary travelers. They'd huddle close, boots to the flames, and tell the same kind of stories the wind been telling since Samuel first laid a seed in the ground. But every so often, someone new would come along and add a verse to that song, stretching its tune just a little further down the road. It was in one of those seasons that a girl named Nora wandered into town, barely 20, old lean limbs and city dust, eyes sharp but tired. She said she'd followed the river up from the coast, walking for weeks with nothing but a map she drew from rumors and a hunger for something that made sense. The world she'd left behind was eating itself alive, prices climbing, hearts shrinking, and every man chasing a future faster than his soul could run. She'd been working in one of those new digital brokerages, trading air for numbers, watching fortunes rise and fall in seconds flat. Then one day the market crashed, and so did she. I didn't lose my money, she told them. I lost my reason for earning it. When she first saw continuance, she thought it was a trick, too quiet, too kind, a town that still traded favors, not currencies, a place where nobody bragged about the size of their harvest, only about how many folks they shared it with. They gave her a room above the bakery, and every morning she'd wake to the smell of fresh bread and the sound of laughter below. It unnerved her at first. Happiness without a price tag always does. But she stayed. She helped where she could, learning to mend fences, plant rows, even fix the slow clock Henry Ross had built so many generations of. She found herself drawn to the ledgers, those worn volumes in the library, filled with the thoughts of people who built the place from patience and hope. She read about Samuel River, June's stubborn faith, Ada Journey, Henry Clock, Eli Quiet Trade. Each name was a thread, and together they wove a tapestry that stretched further than any economy, any government, any creed. It wasn't about getting rich. It was about remembering that enough is a kind of wealth, too. That idea struck deep. She started writing herself letters, essays, thoughts scribbled on napkins and scraps of paper, things she wished someone had told her back when she was running after invisible gold. One night, sitting by the fire, she read ever that aloud to the folks that round. "We spent so long trying to buy tomorrow," she said, voice trembling, "that we forgot how to live in today." Nobody clapped. They just nodded slow, like they were listening to thunder moving through their own bones. Over time, Nora began teaching in the schoolhouse math, but not the kind you'd find in books. She showed the children how to measure value, aim hours shared, meals offered, hearts mended. When a little boy asked how much a smile was worth, she said, "Depend on how long you keep it." The others laughed, but the boy didn't. He just nodded, serious. Word of her lesson spread beyond the valley. Travelers came not just to see the bridge or the clock, but to sit in her class listening to the woman who taught money like it was poetry. She started collecting her thoughts into a new ledger, the arithmetic of enough. In it, she wrote of slow markets and fast hearts, of how rest was the asset, and kindness the only real interest that compounded. It was printed by hand, bound in hemp, and sold nowhere, just gifted, passed along from one soul to another like a candle flame that never burned out. Years later, her writings would be quoted by economists who didn't understand them, by politicians who twisted them, and by poets who did neither but love the feel of them anyway. Yes, later, her writings would be quoted by economists who didn't understand them, by politicians who twisted them, and by poets who did neither but love the feel of them anyway. The world was always hungry for words that made sense, even when it wasn't ready to live by them. But in continuance, nobody tried to claim her their own. They let her be another voice in the long conversation between past and future. And when Nora grew old, she'd sit under that same cottonwood, same at Ada, same at Eli, notebook in hand and a faint smile on her lips. Funny things she'd say to any young wanderer who came asking for wisdom. "All my life I chased success till I found a place that didn't chase it out. Turns out what I wanted wasn't more, well, it was still." When she passed, they didn't mourn with grand speeches or statues. They just rang Henry clocks, slow and steady, till its sound blended with the wind. Then they buried her beside the others, beneath the cottonwood wreath, and carved her words into a small wooden marker. "We'd spent so long trying to buy tomorrow that we forgot how to live in today." The seasons turned and her ledger joined the rest in the library. The spine cracked, the pages warm from 100 hands. Every new generation that came through would read her lines and pause. You can hear the hush inside. The one that says, "You're here now. Bad enough." And maybe that what continuance was all along, not a town, not a legend, but a living promise, a whisper carried through centuries that said wealth ain't about abundance, but balance, that time can't be owned, only shared, and that somewhere between hurry and hope there a place where the heart can finally rest without regret. The rain still falls there, the river still hums, and the clock still ticks slow. And if you sit by that fire long enough, maybe you'll hear it too, the murmur of all those who came before, speaking not in sermons, but in truth carved from soil and silence, built to last slow. Years drifted by like soft smoke after the fire dies low, and though the world outside kept chasing the shimmer of faster dreams, continuance held its quiet lie. The valley had become more than a place, it was a rhythm, a steady heartbeat whispering across generations. Travelers still came from far and wide, drawn not by gold or gain, but by that hum, the kind that settles into your bones and makes you remember what you've forgotten. Some stayed a day, some stayed a lifetime, but hard left lighter than they arrived. One winter, a man named Jonah Hale found his way there. He was the kind of wanderer you could read just by looking, coat torn, eyes tired, hands that used to build but had forgotten how. Used to work in finance, so he said, helping folks make their fortunes. He'd tell the locals with a hollow laugh, but the truth came out one cold night by the inn fire, when the whiskey had loosened his pride. "I didn't help him make fortunes," he said softly. "I helped them lose their peace." He'd seen too much of the modern trade, numbers stacking on screens, fortunes vanishing in seconds, people talking about liquidity like it was a kind of faith. He'd been good at it too, built himself a name, a house high on the city hill, a watch that cost more than sense itself, but success, as he learned, is a hungry thing. The more you feed it, the more it eats, till one day you reels hit you on the menu. He came to continuance bars of a story he'd once read online, some thread about a valley where the clocks ran slow and nobody measured worth by profit. Sounded foolish back then, now it sounded Dot's salvation. The townsfolk didn't ask questions, they never did. They put him to work mending fences with the children, patching roofs with the elders, carrying water from the river. The first few days near broke him, not from the labor. He'd worked harder deals in colder rooms, but from the silence. He wasn't used to it, the way the day stretched without numbers, without screens, without someone telling him what he was worth. But little by little, something inside him began to unclench. His hands grew rough again, his back steadier. And when he'd sit on the porch at dusk, watching the horizon fade into that golden quiet, he'd catch himself smiling, the small, honest kind that doesn't ask permission. One afternoon, while helping repair the bell tower near the schoolhouse, he found an old scrap of paper tucked inside the beams. The ink had nearly vanished, but one line was still clear. Money is a mirror. It reflects the soul that earns it. The words hit him deep. He didn't know who wrote M. Maybe June. Maybe Ada, maybe's unnamed hand between. But they lingered like the echo of a sermon long after the church had fallen. He started writing again. Not reports, not contracts, just thoughts. Fragments of what he'd learned too late. He'd sit by the cottonwood, notebook in lap, and pour out everything the years of greed had stolen from him, about how markets moved faster than meaning, how men chased yield but never joy, how real value wasn't something to calculate, but something to feel. He called it the yield of stillness. Unlike the others before him, Jonah never shared his writing widely. He'd leave pages on doorsteps, under chairs, in the post office window. If someone needs it, he said, the wind'll find a way. And somehow, it always did. Travelers found those pages, carried them off, read them aloud in faraway cities. Before long, whispers of the yield started floating across digital spaces, forums, podcasts, little corners of the internet where tired hearts begged, looking for something real. Folks thought it was fiction or myth or rotted, but those who listened closely enough felt the truth hum beneath the words. Years later, a new kind of trade emerged in the world of tide communities, built not on currency but on contribution. They valued slow equity, inspired, they said, by stories from an old valley whose name nobody could quite place, where wealth was measured in moments shared and futures built from patience. And though Jonah never took credit, his notes became part of the root system that kept that idea alive. He grew old in the valley, his hair silver, his eyes kind. Every day he'd visit Henry Clock, listening to his slow swing, the heartbeat that outlived empires. Children would ask him what time it was, and he'd always answer the same, just right. When he passed, they found a final page folded beneath his pillow. On it, in his neat, fading hand, he'd written, "There no such thing, Nid, lost time, only time spent forgetting what matters." They buried him near the others, his marker plain and simple, his story already blended into the soil. And that night, the rain came soft and steady. The people veiled around the fire again. Someone read his words aloud, voice low, the crackle of the flames filling the quiet between lines. When they finished, nobody spoke. The wind moved through the cottonwood, rustling the branches like gentle applause, and above it, that clock kept humming, one beat at a time, slow, patient, eternal. It said that years later, long after continuance faded from maps, travelers still followed stories about it, voices carried in the rain, threads in forgotten archives, lines from books that refused to stay buried. Some say it not a place anymore, it an inheritance, a lesson passed through stories, through people, through the quiet heart of anyone who had stopped long enough to listen to the world breathe, because in the end, continuance was never about the land, it was about the pace, about remembering that sometimes the true kind of wealth don't sparkle, it waits, it listens, it lasts. And maybe, if you listen close enough tonight, you'll hear it too. That low hum drifting through the dark, steady, the fire glow, the whisper of those who learn that peace ain't something you chase, it's something you become. They say every valley has its ick, a voice that carries through the ages, changing shape but never dying. Long after Jonah's final words had settled into the soil, that echo kept moving, humming through hearts that had never seen the cottonwood, never heard the slow tick of Henry Clock, never sat by that patient river. The world had turned electric, inking bright screens and louder lives, towers stretching toward skies that no longer remembered the sound of wind. Yet, beneath all that noise, something was stirring, quiet, stubborn, like a seed in the dark waiting for rain. It started with a woman named Clara Wynn. She wasn't from the valley. She was from the city, high in one of those glass spires where the air hums with ambition and the lights never sleep. She built herself an empire of algorithms, programs that predicted markets before they twitched, a fortune grown on timing and nerve. Her name was whispered in conference halls, printed in magazines, spoken with awe. But behind her steel success was a silence she couldn't buy her way out of. One night, after a decade of climbing, she found herself sitting on her penthouse floor, surrounded by all the things she thought she wanted, staring at the ceiling and wondering why she felt so hollow. That night, while scrolling through the sleepless noise of the net, she found a line from an old post, buried deep in no forgotten forum. There's no such thing as lost time, only time spent forgetting what matters. No author, no date, no tag, just that. She didn't know why, but those words struck like a thunderclap in her chest. She printed them, framed them, but more than that, she started searching for where they came from. The search took months, then years. Every time she thought she'd reached an end, trail bent again, leading through old archives, handwritten scans, even scanned letters from a man named Eli Ward, a teacher named Nora, an inventor like Henry Ross, all threads fading toward the same story, a valley that might never have existed, a place named Quentin Ewens. The more she read, the clearer it became. It wasn't about geography. It was a philosophy, a way of being, and she wanted it. So she walked away, sold the company, donated the stock, left the glass behind. People all her mad said she was having a breakdown. Maybe she was, but sometimes you gotta break down to remember what it feels like to stand still. She packed a small bag, took a train west, then a bus south, then started walking. No destination, just movement toward quiet. Weeks later, somewhere in the folds of forgotten country, she found herself following a river road. It was old, cracked, almost overgrown, but something about it felt familiar. She followed it to dusk, when she came upon a bridge so worn the carvings had nearly vanished. She brushed her fingers across the stone and made out faint letters, built to last slow. The air around her stilled. The hum of the world softened, and for the first time in years, she wept. There was no town, just remnants. A few stone foundations, the faint shape of fields now claimed by grass, and that cottonwood, old at a whisper. Yet the place breathed, same as before. The kind of quiet that ain't empty, but full, like the pause before dawn when the whole world holds its breath. She stayed, slept beneath the tree, washed in the river, cooked what little she could over a fire that didn't need to prove itself. Over the months, other travelers found their way there too. Some came searching, others running. They built small shelters, tilled small gardens, shared what they had. They didn't rebuild continuance the way it was. They just lived the way it meant. Clara started reading too. She took those for her essays, reflections, stories about people who'd forgotten how to be still. But she didn't write about wealth or investment. She wrote about enough, about how peace was the oldest currency and generosity the only real road. Her collection became known in The Ledger Reborn. It spread the same way the others had, quietly. Someone copied it. Someone else read it by candlelight. Soon her words slipped through the cities like the wind through high grass. A movement began. Not a rebellion, but a rerouting. People started gathering again in small circles, both online and off, calling themselves keepers of the slow flame. They didn't preach or protest, they practiced, shared meals, taught patience, built things by hand. Some heart it naive, some heart it hope. Clara never claimed to be a founder. I didn't make this, she'd say whenever someone thanked her. I unfound what was already waiting. In her last years, she built a small clock from wood and river stone. Sit and read Henry Old Tower once stood. It didn't tick with precision. Sometimes it paused, sometimes it hummed, but it never stopped. When asked why she didn't fix it, she just smiled. Because time doesn't need fixing, just listening. When she passed, people didn't mourn her with ceremony. They laid her beneath the cottonwood beside all the others, her epitaph carved into the stone by hand, built to last slow. The same words that started it. The same promise the world kept forgetting and finding again. And maybe that's what continuance was always meant to be. Not a place to live forever, but a reminder that forever lives in how we choose to live now. A story that keeps finding its way back through the cracks of history, whispering to anyone still rushing through their days. Ease up, partner. You ain't late for your own life. The rain still falls there, soft day forgiveness. The river still hums, and that clock, old and uneven, still keeps time not by seconds, but by moments worth remembering. If you will find yourself lost and the world feels too fast, maybe vote a quiet road west of reason. You might not find continuance on a map, but if you listen close enough, you'll hear it in your own chest. The hunger of patience, the yield of stillness, the wealth of its being. They say the land never truly forgets those who've walked it with purpose. Long after Clara was gone, the valley she'd rekindled began to change again slowly, quietly, like the tide rolling back to shore. The people who'd be at Asia Druplost were dashed right into the kick out of page. Unload powell and during total run, that's amazing. And the yield of stillness, the wealth of its being. They say the land never truly forgets those who've walked it with purpose and the steps to build wealth that lasts. Every choice you make, every small action is a seed planted in your journey to success. Feel the calm wash over you as visions of financial freedom and abundance take shape in your mind. This is your time to relax, breathe, and let the stories of triumph guide you toward your dreams. Rest now, and let prosperity find its way into your life, quietly, naturally. I'm the like when we call you that first year, process having near dead. It's a just thing, though. Chinese thing, woman, I love this, he has been very extreme, that's where Chinese is whatever. So, I'm right on. He'd come looking for the truth behind the myth of the slow town. The name had popped up in his work, Again and Eck, academic journals, podcasts, even corporate workshops preaching mindful productivity. But Oliver pointed back to one legend, a valley that measured wealth by kindness and time by stillness. He'd come to prove it never existed. He found instead what he couldn't disprove. A people who didn't chase profit yet never lacked what they needed. A place where the air itself seemed unburdened by hurry. At first he watched from a distance, scribbling notes. Like any reporter with names, customs, peculiar turns of phrase, they spoke slow, those folks. Paused often, looked a man in the eye before answering. It unnerved him, that stillness. In the city, silence was something you paid extra to escape from. Here, it was the very air they breathed. Days turned into weeks. He helped what he could haul in wood, fixing fences, gathering rainwater. The notebook stayed in his coat pocket longer each day, until finally, one dawn, he left it behind entirely. That when the change started, he began listening instead of recording. During their trade, what they faced circled, keeping a system without banks or contracts, where value flowed through mutual trust. You fixed a roof, someone baked your bread, you tended their crops, they watched your children. It wasn't barter, it was balance. And the strangest thing was, it worked. The town thrived, quiet but steady. One evening, sitting round the fire, an elder named Mara handed a liar a folded page from an old, water-worn ledger. You're not the first to come looking, she said, voice raspy a wind through pines. You're just the first to stay long enough to understand. The page bore faint ink marks, faded but legible enough. Wealth is what remains when you have nothing left to trade. He stared at it for a long time, trying to place its origin. Mara just smiled. Doesn't matter who wrote it. Every generation signs it in their own way. Months passed. The journalist became part of the rhythm. When he finally did write again, his words weren't about proof or fact. They were reflections. He titled his book The Slow Inheritance. Beneath, sitting round the fire, an elder named Mara handed a liar a folded page from an old, water-worn ledger. You're not the first to come looking, she said, voice raspy a wind through pines. You're just the first to stay long enough to understand. The page bore faint ink marks, faded but legible enough. Wealth is what remains when you have nothing left to trade. He stared at it for a long time, trying to place its origin. Mara just smiled. Doesn't matter who wrote it. Every generation signs it in their own way. Months passed. The journalist became part of the rhythm. When he finally did write again, his words weren't about proof or fact, they were reflections. He titled his book, The Slow Inheritance, N-A-B-N-N-E-D. He described not a utopia, but a practice, a way of remembering that the measure of success ain't found in ledgers or clocks, but in the way a man sits with his neighbor after a long day, sharing what little he got with ease in his heart. The book spread like wildfire among the weary, entrepreneurs burning out, workers drowning in deadlines, dreamers looking for air. Folks began reading his words over campfires in cafes, even through rain-specked train windows, letting the idea of slowness seep back into their pulse. A liar didn't return to the city. He stayed to his hair turned gay, his hands rough from labor. When visitors came asking for interviews or footage, he'd just laugh. You can't photograph peace, he'd tell them. You gotta feel it. They'd always leave with something else instead. A loaf of bread, a seedling, a story. Some carried those gifts back to their busy world and started new little communities of their own slow farms, small craft guilds, quiet cooperatives. They said they weren't copying continuance, they were continuing it. Decades rolled on, the town stayed humble, yet its ale grew. The slow movement in the outside world called it, became a force. Scorch and borrowed the language without the soul. Governments tried to brand it, but through all the noise, one truth kept rising to the surface. The same truth that Samuel, June, Ada, Henry, Nora, Jonah, and Clara had lived in their own way. You can't rush meaning. When the liar passed, the people didn't hold a funeral. They held a gathering. No speeches, no tears, just the sound of rain on rooftops and the scent of pine smoke in the air. They placed his journal beneath the cottonwood, beside the old ledgers. Another voice added to the harmony. Another slow heartbeat folded into the valley pulse. Years later, long after roads had shifted and maps had forgotten, travelers still claimed to feel something when they passed that stretch of river. Some said it was the hum of the clock buried deep beneath the roots. Others said it was the land itself breathing through the centuries. Whatever it was, it had weight. Not the kind that burdens, but the kind that anchors. A reminder whispered through the dusk. Slow down, you're already here. And if you find yourself hearing that hum on a cold night, maybe you'll understand too that peace don't vanish when the world speeds up. It waits patient day and rain for someone to stop long enough to listen. Time, in its quiet cruelty, moves like a slow river, bending, shaping, and burying what it must, but never truly erasing what meant to stay. Long after Lear's final words had faded into the valley wind, the world outside changed being, faster, louder, brighter than ever before. Cities pulsed with neon and noise, the skies swarmed with drones, and currency no longer jingled in pockets but shimmered on screens. They called it the era of infinite flow. Every man and woman was their own market now, selling moments, selling thoughts, selling time. It was progress, they said, the time that couldn't be stopped. And yet, beneath all that glow, people started to rake. Quietly at first, sleepless nights became months, then years. Eyes red not from labor, but from scrolling through lives they'd never lived. Every person a brand, every dream a product. They were richer than none and emptier than dust. But always, the wind of remembrance finds its way through cracks. And through that storm of consumption, whispers began to surface again. Stories of the valley that never hurried. Old names resurfaced in new tongues. Samuel, Ada, Clara, Ilior. Not then people, but at ideas, pillar of a forgotten rhythm. One of those whispers found its way to a man named Royce Danner. He was a creator of sorts, not the kind who shaped wood or iron, but the kind who shaped illusion. Built empires out of attention, crafted trends that burned bright and fast and met teddiers. His name was known across the digital frontier, but after years of living for the algorithm, he woke one dawn to find that the faces watching him no longer felt real. He had followers, not friends, metrics, not memories. And when his mother passed, he realized no one on him even knew her name. That broke him. He vanished, deleted every account, sold his penthouse, and took off with nothing but a bag, a notebook, and a stubborn ache that words couldn't soothe. For months, he wandered the back roads, searching for something that didn't flash or fade. It was on a night soaked in rain that he found it, or maybe it found him. A flickering lantern on a post. A trail half swallowed by weeds in that same weather sign, built to last slow. He followed it through the mud to dawn, broke soft and gold. That it was not a grand town, not even a map worth of one, that a few cabins, a garden, and that old cottonwood still standing proud. Folks greeted him the same way they had greeted every lost soul before, with nods, silence, and the offer of bread. No questions, no headlines, just presence. It took months for him to stop speaking like a man who had to perform his every thought. He'd start telling a story, then pause, expecting laughter, applause, reaction, but none came. Only the sound of the wind, the hum of bees, and the creak of that river bridge. It humbled him. That quiet scared him too. Until one morning, sitting by the fields, he heard the children reciting something old. Words passed down like a hymn. We keep the flame, but never the fame. It passed the seed, not the name. It hit him in scripture. For the first time in years, he picked up his pen, not to perform, but to remember. He wrote of how fame feeds on fear, how noise drowns the heart, how the truest measure of a man ain't in who watches him, but in who waits for him. He heard it, the quiet dividend. The townsfolk never asked to read it, but copies appeared anyway, carved into planks, ink on walls, murmured in markets far beyond the valley. And just like those before him, Royce's story escaped him. It drifted across networks and found its way into the weary corners of the modern mind. People who'd never met him began quoting his lines in their own tongues, using his words that medicine for their restless days. Then came the turn no one expected, a movement among the young born from those words. They called themselves the Slow Hands. Not a cult, not a commune, just wanderers who believed in earning stillness the way others earned gold. They left the cities, the feeds, the rush. They built garden where servers once stood, planted trees where billboards had fallen. Some bellowed at rebellion, but to them it was reclamation. They weren't rejecting progress, they were refining, one heartbeat at a time. And for a while the world laughed at them, but laughter fades faster than truth. Within a decade their quiet grew louder than any slogan. They built small networks, not digital, but human. Shared crops, shared craft, shared stories. Corporate tried to buy them, governments tried to study them, but they couldn't be owned because they had no central leader, no symbol, no brand. Just an echo, an inheritance too patient to be erased. And somewhere deep within that voice could still be heard. Low, calm, almost like a hum between the drops of rain. You can't sell peace, he'd once said by a campfire, but you can give it away until everyone rich. When he passed, the Slow Hands didn't mourn him with monuments. They led by rivers and whispered his favorite line to the wind. The loudest prophet is silence, well kept. Then they let the wind carry it just as the valley had done for centuries. And so the story continued, not in chapters, not in names, but in practice. In every man who chose patience over pride, in every woman who built slower and stronger, in every child who learned that life ain't a race to the grave, but a walk through wonder. Continuance, it seemed, had never vanished. It had simply gone digital, carried now not by blood or soil, but by hearts that refused to forget. Because the truth is, the valley was never a place. It was a choice. One the world keeps losing and finding again, like breath itself. And at long ends, one person somewhere remembers to live slow, to listen deep, to love long. The flame stays lit, and the hum never dies. When the Slow Hands movement reached its quiet peak, something curious began happening. You'd think the noise of the modern world would drown them out again, but instead, it bent around them like water around stone. They didn't fight the current, didn't try to stop progress. They just kept living slower, softer, more deliberate. And the more they did, the more the rest of the world started to listen. Not in a grand global way at first, no revolutions or headlines, just little things. A factory foreman deciding to shorten shifts so his workers could have dinner with their family. A banker who swapped his penthouse for a small ranch house where he could hear crickets at night. A mother in the city turning off her screens at dusk so her kids could watch the sunset from their window instead of a tablet. Nobody brought it a movement anymore. It was more like a memory resurfacing, a collective sigh shared by millions who'd forgotten how to breathe. One of them was a fella named Caleb Rhodes, a craftsman by trade, a thinker by accident. He was one of the world's last true watchmakers, still working by hand when machines had long outpaced him. For decades, he'd watched his art turn obsolete, replaced by glass rectangles that told perfect time but had no soul. He used to say, "A clock ain't supposed to be flawless. It's supposed to remind you that time moves." When the first Slow Hands community reached out to him, asking if he'd come teach him the craft, he packed up what few tools he had and headed out. Didn't know what to expect. Maybe a cult, maybe a commune, maybe yet a bunch of dreamers looking for something to believe in. What he found was a village that reminded him of a heartbeat, steady, humble, alive. They built things that lasted, not because they needed to, because they wanted to. Each person tended their craft like a vow, and when they asked him to build them a clock to mark their gatherings, he didn't build one, he built 7. One for each corner of the valley, each a little different. One ticking slow, one soft, one loud enough to be heard in the rain. Together they played a rhythm you could live by. He called it the measure of enough. That clock chorus became legend. Travelers who came to the valley said you could tell what kind of day it was by which clock sang loudest. On bright days, the east clock echoed sharp and proud. On stormy nights, the river clock murmured through the fog like a lullaby. The folks said it was the valley way of talking, reminding them that even time could change its tone depending on the heart that listened. Caleb never married, never had kin, but when he passed, he left behind a notebook filled with sketches and sayings. One of them was scrawled in thick pencil across the last page. When a man makes peace with time, he stops trying to beat it. That line spread faster than wildfire, found its way into schools, sermons, speeches. Before long, the world started bending again. Investors began funding long-term ventures instead of quick returns. Architects started building with stone instead of steel, with gardens instead of towers. The word slow stopped being an insult and started meaning wise. Productivity coaches quoted Caleb without knowing his name. Politicians tried to spin it into policy. And while most of that was just noise again, surface-level imitations, a few rare souls understood. One of them was a young coder named Tess Calder. She grew up in the city, part of the generation that never knew quiet. Every thought she did came with a notification. She was good, too good at what she did, building systems that could simulate voices, emotions, even love. But one night, deep in her own creation, she realized her machine was comforting her better than she could comfort herself. That terrified her, so she left. Like Clara before her, like Royce, she followed whispers and digital breadcrumbs till she found the valley, or maybe they found what it stood for. She carried with her a device, small, round, and humming with life. She called it Echo Seed. It was designed to record the sound of peace, real peace, and send it quietly through the world networks. Not at a broadcast, not at an ad, but at a heartbeat hidden in the noise, a digital campfire. She recorded the valley one rainy night, the wind, the creak of the cottonwood, the layered ticks of Caleb clocks. Then they released it. No promotion, no hashtags, just a hum. A week later, people in faraway cities began hearing it in their sleep, soft, warm, unplaceable. Some said it slowed their pulse. Some said it brought tears. No one knew where it came from. They called it the Nakwachong without a singer. And though no one could trace it, everyone who heard it felt the same thing, a memory they couldn't name. The sound of something they'd lost but hadn't forgotten. Scientists tried to decode it. Theories ranged from viral right to quantum interference, but the truth was simpler than that. It was the world remembering itself, a quiet rebellion against the noise. In time, Tess returned to the valley. Her hair had silvered, her eyes soft from years of listening. When folks asked her if she'd made the murmur on purpose, she just smiled that same slow smile the old ones used to wear. Maybe it wasn't me who sent it, she said. Maybe it was the valley itself. Just like that, the circle closed again. Another soul carried in, another air carried out. The clock still ticked, the rain still fell, and the cottonwood still whispered the same truth it had from the start. There's no such thing he had lost time, only time spent forgetting what matters. I'm just trying to decode it. Theories ranged from viral right to quantum interference, but the truth was simpler than that. It was the world remembering itself, a quiet rebellion against the noise. In time, Tess returned to the valley. Her hair had silvered, her eyes soft from years of listening. When folks asked her if she'd made the murmur on purpose, she just smiled that same slow smile the old ones used to wear. Maybe it wasn't me who sent it, she said. Maybe it was the valley itself. Just like that, the circle closed again. Another soul carried in, another air carried out. The clock still ticked, the rain still fell, and the cottonwood still whispered the same truth it had from the start. There's no such thing, ye lost time. Only time spent forgetting what matters. After the murmur had circled the earth like a ghostly lullaby, the world seemed to slow, not all at once, but in ripples like raindrops spreading across a pond. It was not something folks announced or voted on. It just happened. People started taking their shoes off when walking on grass ad. Workdays ended earlier. Markets began praising patience the way they used to praise speed. And though the old city still pulsed with neon in motion, you could see something changing in the corners. A cafe with no Wi-Fi sign, a farmer stall that closed at sunset instead of midnight, a company that advertised handwritten letters delivered slow. It was that if the murmur had reminded everyone that peace wasn't a luxury, it was a right they'd forgotten to claim. But not everyone liked the change. There were those who built their empires on urgency, brokers, data barons, instant delivery kings. They thought it the great stall. They said the slowdown was poisoning the economy, killing productivity, threatening innovation. And maybe from their tower windows it looked that way. The graphs dipped, the numbers flattened, but out in the small places, the farms, the coast lanes, the towns tucked beneath mountains, things were quietly thriving. The soil healed. Rivers ran clear again, and hearts, well, they found a new kind of rhythm, one that didn't rush to outpace its own beat. Amidst that quiet rebellion lived a man named Silas Wren. He was a trader by blood, born into a dynasty that measured worth in decimal points. His father had run one of the last megabanks, still clinging to the old world creed, grow or die. Silas grew up learning to see time as a resource, people add variables, and every sunrise is their opportunity to outbid someone else's peace. By 30, he'd become the youngest chief negotiator on the Intercontinental Trade Council. By 40, he was the richest man never to own a home. But the murmur, it found him too. Not in a dream, not in a broadcast. It found him one night when his plane broke down over a forgotten airfield, leaving him stranded in the middle of nowhere. The nearest town was 10 miles south, and when he reached it soaked and cussing, he saw a small wooden sign hanging above the road. It read, "Welcome, traveler. Here, time don't owe you nothing." The place had no bank, no market tickers, no noise, just a few lanterns flickering beneath a wide old sky. A man at the gate offered him warm cider and a blanket, said his name was Eben, keeper of the clocks. Silas scoffed at that. "You mean you fix 'em?" he asked. Oh, Eben said, "I listened to him. Turns out the village was built round one of Caleb's old clocks, the western one, the one that ticked loudest in the storm. They called it the balance clock, and once every year the whole town dared to clean it, polish its brass, and sit in silence while it ticked, marking another year of survival, not success." Silas thought it was madness, but the more he watched, the more he saw something he'd never seen before. People who weren't fighting time weren't running from it either. They were in rhythm with it. He stayed 3 nights that first time. No contract, no money hands. When he left, he didn't tell a soul where he'd been, but he started changing things in his work. Slower trade schedules, fairer contracts, transparency laws. His colleagues called him sentimental, said he'd gone soft, but profits didn't fall. They steadied. Nations stopped feuding over cents on the dollar and started talking about balance sheets and seasons instead of quarters. Silas became a legend for reasons he didn't quite understand. The economists couldn't explain it, but his calm made others calm. They thought it the Wren effect. Years later, when he retired, Silas vanished without ceremony, just walked out of a meeting mid-sentence and never came back. Some said he returned to that quiet village. Others said he built one of his own. No one have found proof. But every few years, a rumor would surface of a small town where a brass clock still sang through the night, its rhythm steady at a heartbeat, its keeper humming low tunes to travelers passing through. By then, the old world had begun to fade for good. Automation took what little rush remained. The ebb of competition gave way to cooperation, and wealth stopped meaning hordes of digits. Instead, people tracked what they called returns of soul. How many lives were lifted? How many days were lived well? Currency became memory. Economy became ecology. And though not everyone understood it, most accepted it, as the hum never left. Even the machines learned to move in sync with it. There were whispers that the murmur had seeped into every circuit, every frequency, changing the pulse of the planet itself. Maybe it had, Oroy people just finally started listening close enough to hear the song that'd been there all along. Either way, the world got slower and richer for it, generations later. Children would ask their elders about the time before the murmur, when people worked till they broke, when rest was guilt, when life was measured in speed, and the elders would chuckle, shaking their heads, saying, "We used to think peace was something you earned, but turns out it's something you remember." And so it went, and it always had and always will, the circle expanding, the echo deepening, the hum remaining beneath it. The clock still ticked, the rain still fell, the land still remembered, and every time someone sat by a fire, watching sparks drift into the dark, they'd swear they heard that same old whisper riding the wind. "You're not running out of time, partner, you're just finally catching up to it." Long after Silas Wren's name faded into dust and wind, the valleyway kept breathing through the cracks of time, not that a law or a movement anymore, but a quiet inheritance passed through blood, through soil, through whispers. The hum of the old clocks never stopped, though most of them had rusted to near silence. They still marked the rhythm of the world for those patient enough to listen. Somewhere, far beyond the last known maps, a new wanderer was about to hear that hum for the first time. His name was Jonah Callum. He was born in the era folks solved the drift, when technology had gone so far ahead of men's hearts that people forgot how to walk without directions. You didn't ask for advice anymore, you just asked the grid. The machines told you where to go, what to eat, how to feel, when to rest. They said it made life simpler, but Jonah never felt simple. He worked there, a data architect, building the frameworks that let people escape into virtual habits so real you could smell the pine or taste the rain. He was good at it, too good maybe, and that what broke him. One night, while testing a prototype meant to simulate peace, he realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd felt it for real. The irony clawed at him. He sat there, surrounded by blue light and humming circuits, and started laughing until he cried. The next morning, he shut down his terminal, packed a bag, and disappeared. He left no message, no note, just a small lie scrawled across his desk. "I can't build what I've never lived." He wandered west for months, borrowing no map, no compass, just instinct or maybe something older. Towns were rare by then, and the few that still stood were hollow, all automation, no pulse. He'd sleep under broken billboards that used to glow with promises, now overgrown with vines and birds. He'd sleep under broken billboards that used to glow with promises, now overgrown with vines and birds. Traded old tech parts for bread and firewood, learning to speak less and listen more. And in that silence, he started hearing things again, not voices, but the rhythm of the earth itself. It scared him at first, then it steadied him. One stormy evening, when his clothes were soaked and his spirit was near broke, he found a cabin leaning against a hillside, light flickering in the window. He knocked. An old woman opened the door. "You're late," she said, like she'd been expecting him. She held herself Maeve, and her hands looked like they'd spent a lifetime shaping clay and soil. She gave him soup, dry socks, and silence, the kind that doesn't demand gratitude. When the rain slowed, he asked if she lived alone. She nodded. "Me and the clock," she said. That was the first time he heard them, soft, steady, scattered through the house like heartbeats. Each one ticked different, some fast, as slow, yet almost imperceptible. He knelt one by the hearth that didn't move at all. "That one dead," he said. Maeve smiled. "Ain't dead," she whispered, "just shading." And over the next few weeks, Jonah stayed on, fixing fences, hauling water, helping with what she called her home. Garden, he never asked what that meant, till one dawn when she led him up a ridge, where 7 small towers stood, made of wood and brass, turning gently with the wind. "They sing," she said, when the world read to listen. He heard nothing at first, only wind. Then faintly, a low vibration, deep memory, soft in breath. It was the same frequency he'd once tried to code into his virtual peace project, except this wasn't artificial. This was alive. Maeve told him stories as they tended the towers, of Royce and Tess, of Caleb and Silas, of the ones who came before and left behind not empires but echoes. She said the hum had been carried across generations like a seed, each person planting it in their own way, through words, through craft, through care. Jonah asked her how it kept going after so long.
She looked down to and said, "Because peace don't die, it waits for the noisy to get tired." When she passed that winter, Jonah buried her beneath the ridge, right between the hum towers. He stayed there through the thaw, through the bloom, through the next storm. He began repairing the broken clocks, one by one, listening for their rhythm, learning to feel their patience. Then he did something no one had done in generations. He built a new one. Not digital, not mechanical either. It was a hybrid, part clock, part wind instrument, part recorder. It measured time not in seconds, but in moments of stillness. He called it the listener. He sent one to every settlement that still remembered the Valley Way. No instructions, no explanations, just a device and a note that said, set it where the wind can reach it. Within a year, the hum grew louder again, now carried not by code or copper, but by breath and intention. Cities reported strange harmonics echoing through alleyways. Mountains hummed at night. Folks said they felt calmer without knowing why.
And though Jonah never claimed credit, people started calling it the listener's song. He lived the rest of his life on that ridge, keeping the hum steady, speaking little, smealing much. When wanderers found him, he'd greet them the way Maeve had greeted him. You're late. And when they asked what the hum meant, he'd say the same words, softer to confession. It means the world remembering how to listen. Maybe that was all any of it was. Not invention, not rebellion, but remembrance. A loop older than language, carried by hearts that refused to harden. A whisper through rain, through code, through the bones of every man and woman who'd have chosen patience over pride. The world didn't change all at once, it just remembered itself again. One quiet choice at a time. And when the night grew deep and the wind sang through the towers, Jonah would sit by the fire, tip his hat and murmur into the flame. Still ticking, old friend, still ticking. Years rolled by like tumbleweeds across an endless plain, and though Jonah Callum fire had long gone cold, the hum he tended refused to die. It threaded itself into the marrow of the world, moving between generations like smoke through the rafters of time. Folks didn't talk much about the listener's song anymore. It wasn't a legend, not exactly. It's something that lived quietly inside people. When a man paused before speaking in anger, or when a mother let her child watch the rain instead of a screen, that was the hum working. You couldn't see it, couldn't hold it, but you could feel it. That the heartbeat of something that had never stopped breathing. In the highlands north of Jonah once sat, there lived a girl named LCD. She was born into a world that had mostly forgotten what hurry felt like. Machines worked slow and kind. Houses were built to last. And wealth was counted in favors and laughter, not credits. Still, Elsie felt restless. Maybe it was the wind in her blood. Maybe just curiosity. She wanted to know where the hum came from. The elders told her stories of the clocks, of the valley, of the old cowboy who whispered lessons by firelight. But she didn't want stories. She wanted truth. One summer morning, she packed a sachet with dried berries, a knife, and her grandfather's pocket watch, a relic from a world that once measured everything but what mattered. The watch didn't tick anymore, but she carried it like a compass. It'll guide you to silence, her grandmother had said, which sounded foolish then, but started making sense the farther she walked. Her journey took her through lands that were more memory than map. Old highways cracked open by grass, broken drones rusting under moss, windmills turned slow in thought. She crossed rivers by their shallows and slept beside the bones of cities where streetlights had long been replaced by starlight. And though she met few people, each one she found seemed to know something about where she was headed. A fisherman pointed her west, saying, "Follow where the gulls turn quiet." A farmer nodded south, whispering, "Seek where the wheat bends twice before the storm." A child handed her a smooth stone and said, "You'll know you're close when it hums." She didn't question him. You don't question the language of the patient. Weeks passed, then months. She stopped counting the days. And one night, under a silver moon that looked too perfect to be real, she reached a valley. Wide, silent, familiar somehow, like a place she'd dreamed of before she'd even been born. The air carried a sound so faint it made her chest ache, a low, steady rhythm that was not wind or thunder. She followed it down into the hollow until she found what she was looking for. 7 towers standing crooked on a ridge, turning in the breath of the night. The hum wrapped around her like a memory of warmth. At the base of the tallest tower sat a wooden chair, worn and empty. Next to it, a note carved into the stone. "Sit a while. Time will find you." So she did. Hours passed, maybe days. The hum changed, deepened, until she began hearing words that weren't words. The soft murmur of stories layered on stories. A banker who learned patience, a craftsman who built clocks that sang, a coder who made silence go viral, and beneath it, a cowboy low voice laughing through the dark. "Still ticking, partner." She smiled through tears. "Still listening," she whispered. When she rose, the pocket watch in her coat began to tick, slow, uneven, but alive. It pulsed in rhythm with the hum, and she understood. The watch wasn't broken. It had yet been waiting for a world quiet enough to start again. Elsie didn't stay. The valley wasn't meant to hold people anymore. It was meant to remind them. She left the next morning with the hum in her chest and the watch in her hand, walking back toward the noise of the world, carrying peace like fire in her pocket. Wherever you went, people felt calmer. Markets grew patient. Towns rebuilt without rush. Although she never claimed to be anything special, folks started calling her the keeper of the quiet. In her later years, when gaze streaked her hair and her hands trembled like candlelight, she'd sit by her porch during storms, humming softly. Children gathered round to hear her stories, not of heroes or wars, but of clocks and rain, of humble hands that built something stronger than progress. She'd always end the same way, looking out at the horizon with that slow smile that old Joel's wear. Don't you worry about time, little ones. Time ain't your enemy. It's your oldest friend you're waiting for you to walk beside it. When she passed, they buried her under a sycamore, and the wind through its branches made a sound no one could explain, like breath, like song, like memory. The hum lived on, moving through leaves and rivers and the cracks between moments. Nobody owned it, nobody good. It was free, same as it had always been. And the centuries rolled forward. That freedom became the world's new currency, not gold, not code, but quiet. Cities were built with sound in mind, walls designed to breathe instead of air. Economies measured their success by stillness restored. And once every year on the day of Elsie passing, people everywhere stopped for 1 full minute, not to mourn, but to listen, to hear if the hum was still there. It always was, soft at a campfire, steady at a heartbeat, old to dust. And if you listen real close, even now, you can still hear it somewhere under the rain, that gentle cowboy drawl, laughing low through the wind. Reckon we did all right, partner. The world finally remembered what quiet sounds like. You know, if you didn't have Reckon we did all right, partner. The world finally remembered what quiet sounds like. Long after Elsie Dunn's name had faded into folklore and her sycamore roots had spread wide across that quiet hill, the world rolled onward into another age, slower, gentle, yet still searching. For though peace had returned to the earth, humanity had never stopped its instinct to wonder. The hum had become part of life, but no one truly knew what it was anymore. Some called it divine. Others said it was science, the earth pulse, or the frequency of balance itself. But most folks didn't bother labeling it. They just lived by it. Then came a man named Ryder Bale. He wasn't born into silence. He came into the world kicking, crying, and surrounded by noise. The hum was still there, but faint now, like a dream you couldn't quite recall when you woke. His town was small, wedged between the red mesas and the last remains of a once mighty city. The towers stood dead and hollow, their glass ribs glinting under the sun, while the fields stretched golden and whispering all around. Folks made their living by trading stillness for power, the kind that hummed in machines. It was said the hum, when trapped right, could charge batteries for a decade, and though they used it every day, none of them truly understood it. Ryder was curious, dangerously so. He'd grown up hearing old stories about Caleb Royce, Silas Wren, and Elsie Dude. His granddad used to sit on the porch at dusk, telling tales of the first hum, the great clocks, the valley that taught the world patience. But to Ryder, they sounded the bedtime myths. He wanted proof. He wanted to see it. So when he was 16, he left home carrying a rusted harmonizer from his granddad's shed, a device meant to catch the hum like a net catch wind. He headed west, where the old maps ended and the land turned wild. For weeks he traveled across the cracked salt plains, through ghost towns, into the mountains with clouds moved be herds. Followed Whisper's old coordinates and a string of letters left behind by a long-forgotten society called the Listeners' Guild. Most of the letters were unread, the ink washed out by time. But one phrase repeated over and over, the hum is not sound. In memory, he didn't understand it, not then. But the deeper he went into the wilderness, the more he started feeling it, that low, invisible rhythm beneath everything. His harmonizer began to twitch on its own, its dial shifting whenever he walked near still water or sat beneath stars. It wasn't averting any sound, it was reacting to something older. By the time he reached the valley, or what was left of it, the air was heavy with stillness. The 7 towers still stood, though half of them had fallen into ruin. Moss crawled up their sides and their gears were half swallowed by the earth. But even through the rust, the hum was there, faint, stubborn, alive. Ryder set up camp beneath the largest tower and began rebuilding his harmonizer, using pieces scavenged from the fallen ones. It took him weeks, made months he lost track.
Under home the one dances decking his column where on this. Luddington, but the no one really was it was. He knew the crowd the sound shine. And but to speak free reply that just go you all along the board I know like the river has but he made nothing advised and I had good out of told now even of obvious but a feeling who came a voice soft and water that whispering like it was sitting right beside his file still isn't what notes for those very froze.
He knew that voice. He'd never heard it before, but he knew it that the earth itself was speaking. He answered without thinking, still searching.
The voice chuckled slow and fond. Then you're halfway there. Then it was gone. Just wind and rain. But the hum changed after that. It grew louder, clearer. When Ryder touched the harmonizer, visions flickered in his mind. Faces he didn't know, voices he couldn't name, a craftsman polishing brass, a banker looking at stars, a young woman watching leaves fall beside a river, all of them humming the same tune.
Realized he wasn't hearing ghosts, he was hearing history. He stayed in that valley for years, learning how to weave those echoes into something new. He recorded them not onto drives or chips, but into wind chambers carved from wood and stone. When the breeze passed through, they'd sing. Each chamber told a piece of the long story of patience, the generations that built, broke, and rebuilt peace. Travelers began finding their way there, drawn by stories of a valley that sings lip. Ryder would greet each one the same way, grin under his scruff and saying, "You're late." The people who came didn't leave empty-handed. Some took a shard of humstone, others left something behind, a letter, a song, a vow. Slowly the place became a pilgrimage, not a temple, not a shrine, but a reminder, and the world beyond that began to shift again. Trade routes slowed, machines learned to idle, people began measuring progress not by how much they gained, but how little they disturbed. Economists called it the return curve. Poets just called it home. Before Ryder time came, he recorded one final message in his harmonizer. They say it still plays when the wind hits it, right? No one's sure of the exact words, but the travelers who've heard it agree on the ending. A quiet laugh, a sigh, and then a whisper riding the breeze like smoke through pine. Don't go chasing forever, friend. It been right here, humming the whole damn time. Ryder Bell Valley became a legend that wandered on the wind, half folklore, half truth, told in whispers beside fires and under tin roofs, while the rain drummed soft against the world. The hum no longer needed guardians. It had become part of every breath, every pause, every act of stillness that people took without even noticing. But there are always those born with the itch to look deeper, to see where the peace came from, to touch the bones of the story rather than just hum along. One such soul was a drifter named Callahan Pike. Folks call him Cal the Quiet, not because he never spoke, but because when he did, the whole room went still. He had that presence, that kind of gravity born from living through too much noise and learning not to add more. He'd been a trader once, running supplies across the new borderlands where cities met silence, half ruins, half guards. He'd seen what greed still tried to do to the world, saw men who couldn't live without the old hunger. But Cal didn't fight him. He watched, waited, and learned. It was said he carried a sealed object from his youth, an old brass pocket watch that didn't tell time. Instead, it hummed. Faint, like a cat purr, only when the world around him was truly quiet. He didn't know who made it. His father had given it to him when he was a boy, saying, "You'll understand." And he stopped trying to. Cal never did understand it, but he kept it close. When storms came, he'd open it, and it would steady him, like a compass that pointed not north but inward. Years later, Cal found himself wandering through a stretch of Kun where the air itself felt heavier. That same thickness the old stories talked about. It was the same valley, though the world had shifted around it so many times, you'd barely recognize the bones. He'd been a trader once, running supplies across the new borderlands where cities met silence, half ruins, half guards. He'd seen what greed still tried to do to the world, saw men who couldn't live without the old hunger. But Cal didn't fight him. He had watched, waited, and learned. It was said he carried a sealed object from his youth, an old brass pocket watch that didn't tell time. Instead, it hummed, faint, like a cat purr, only when the world around him was truly quiet. He didn't know who made it. His father had given it to him when he was a boy, saying, "You'll understand when you stop trying to." Cal never did understand it, but he kept it close. When storms came, he'd open it, and it would steady him like a compass that pointed not north, but inward. Years later, Cal found himself wandering through a stretch of Kun where the air itself felt heavier, that same thickness the old stories talked about. It was the same valley, though the world had shifted around it so many times you'd barely recognize the bones. The towers were gone now, swallowed by earth and memory. Only the ridges remained, shaped by centuries of wind into soft, round shoulders that seemed to lean toward each other like tired giants. He camped there that night, watching the stars blink through cloud gaps, and for the first time in his life, The pocket watch grew warm. He could hear it humming louder than them before. And when he opened it, the air trembled, not from sound, but from memory. It wasn't but a watch, it was a recording, a living one. Inside it, faint and ghostly, was the voice of Ryder Bale himself, speaking across time like it echoed through canyon walls. If you're hearing this, Ryder said, then the hum found you. Don't mistake it for magic. It ain't divine. It disciplined. It how the world remembers itself through us. Cal listened in awe, sitting there under the stars, the wind pulling the smoke of his fire into spirals. Ryder's voice went on, calm, patient, like a teacher talking to someone who'd already learned half the lesson. The hum don't belong to anyone. You can't own it, can't sell it, can't break it. You can own join it, and when you do well, you stop fighting time. You start walking with it. The message ended with silence, but it wasn't empty. It was full of something Cal couldn't name. He sat there day and night listening to nothing, and by dawn he understood. The hum wasn't in the towers anymore, it was in the people. In the way a farmer waited for his crop instead of rushing it. In the way lovers stayed quiet together instead of filling the air with nervous talk. In the way a craftsman sanded wood slow and steady because he wanted it to last longer than he would. The hum was patience made human. When Cal left the valley, he didn't take the watch. He buried it, but he'd sat under a pile of smooth river stones and carved into the largest one the same words that had echoed for generations before him. Still ticking, he walked east after that, back toward the edges of civilization where neon still fought the dark and noise had started crawling back into men's hearts. But wherever he went, quiet followed. He'd stop by a town, trade a few stories, mend a few broken things, not for money, but for presents. He'd teach the children how to listen to the wind and the grown folks how to rest without guilt. He'd fix their machines, but make sure they ran slower than Vor, saying fast breaks things, slow builds things. Then he'd move on. Within a decade, people started calling him the mender of pace. Nobody knew where he came from or where he went when the seasons turned, but stories of him spread like wildflowers. Some said he was a ghost from the old Hum Valley. Others said he was just a man who'd learned the rhythm of stillness so deep he could carry it with him. Whatever the truth, every place he visited changed, not in ways you could measure, but in ways you could feel. Markets stopped opening before dawn. Workers took breaks to watch the clouds drift. Traders stopped hoarding. A few even built small towers, not for worship, just for listening. And when the wind blew through them, they sang in low tones that blended with the hum of the world, the same way it had in the beginning, the same way it always would. By the time Cal disappeared into the horizon, ridden slow on a mule with a guitar strapped to his back, folks had already started telling stories about him like they had about Elsie, Ryder, and Silas before. But the hum didn't need names anymore. It had become something older, deeper, quieter than all of them. It had become the language of endurance. And so it went, rolling through time like a river through canyons, shaping what it touched, carving lessons into stone, whispering to anyone who dared stop long enough to listen. Maybe that's all it wanted. Not worship, not fame, just ears patient enough to hear what silence had been saying since the start. They say the last man who remembered the hum was born under thunder and named himself no one. No records, no kin, no trace in the census logs or databanks. That a shadow on the edges of quiet towns. A tall fella in a weathered leather coat, humming low tunes that felt older than the dirt itself. He didn't claim to be a prophet, didn't claim to know any truth about the past, but when he walked into a room, every clock slowed, did a little. Even the restless dog stopped barking. Folks called him Gray. Maybe for the streak in his hair, maybe because he lived somewhere between things, not young, not old, not there, not gone. Gray was what the world had come to call a pacekeeper. It was a new trade in an age that didn't rush anymore, but still sometimes forgot why it had slowed down in the first place. Cities had grown wide again, not tall. Buildings breathed. Machines hummed in rhythm with the human heart. But under all that calm, there was always temptation, the whisper of the old world that once measured time by profit and progress. So pacekeepers were sent wandering, not to preach, not to enforce, but to remind. He'd travel from town to town with nothing but a worn sachin, a harmonica, and a sin message that changed every time he said it. Sometimes it was a story, sometimes a question, sometimes yet a silence he'd hold long enough for the world to hear itself again. Wherever he went, things would shift. A factory would stop running through the night. A banker would take his first day off in years. A child would put down a screen and listen to rain. And when they'd ask him where he learned to do that, to speak without words, he'd grin and say, didn't learn it, just remembered it. But Gray had his own hunger. He'd heard about the valley from whispers passed between travelers of the 7 towers, the hum that built a world and the souls who sat by firelight to listen instead of talk. He wanted to find that place, not to claim it, but to see if it was still breathing. He'd heard that the last of the hum was dying, not because it had lost its strength, but because people had stopped believing it was real. Faith, even in silence, can fade. His road led him across half the continent, through cities grown gentle with age, where vines crawled up glass walls and markets smelled of rain instead of smoke. He crossed the quiet sea on a wind ferry, a vessel that moved only when the breeze was kind enough to lend itself. He walked through plains where lightning danced slow like old ghosts, and canyons that still echoed with the laughter of long-dead builders. Every mile, the hum got stronger, not louder, stronger, like it was pulling at his bones, reminding him that he wasn't walking to it, he was walking home. When he reached the valley, he knew it before he saw it. The grass there swayed in rhythm no wind could explain. Birds flew in circles like notes hanging in a song. The air itself had weight, not heavy, just full. He found the stone where Callahan Pike had buried his watch, though the words had worn faint. Still ticking, it said, he hitched tit, and the ground beneath him trembled with memory. Voices layered through the years, Elsie, Ryder, Silas, Jonah, all the ones who'd come before. They weren't calling him. They were welcoming him. He sat by that stone for 3 days without speaking. No food, no sleep. You're listening. And on the third night, the sky broke open with thunder again, the way it had when the hum was first caught. Rain poured down, turning the soil dark veined coffee, and in that storm he understood. The hum wasn't a thing to find or lose. It was the distance between what a man could do and what he should. It was choice made quiet, and every generation had to learn it over again. When dawn came, Gray took out his harmonica. It was dented, old, the brass dulled with time. He wiped it on his sleeve and played one note, soft, cracked, but honest. The hum answered back, low and warm. He smiled, nodded once, and kept playing. The sound spread through the valley like fire on cold wood. Trees swayed, stones vibrated. Somewhere deep beneath the soil, the old gears turned one more time. They say Gray never left that valley. Some say he turned into part of it, a shadow in the mist, a hum in the grass. Others say he walked east again, disappearing into rain, leaving the world dead a little slower than he found it. But every now and then, when a storm rolls through and the thunder fades just right, you can hear a low tune drifting between the drops, a harmonica playing in rhythm with the rain, humming the same truth that been echoing since the first clock stopped counting. That time ain't gone. It did learning how to breathe in. If you sit still long enough, quiet enough, patient enough, you might just hear it too. Long after gray melody vanished into the folds of the valley mist, the hum settled into legend again, soft, unseen, but never gone. The world spun on slower than before, wiser maybe, but still human, still forgetful, still yearning. Empires had been built and buried, patience had been found and lost and found in, and yet every few generations someone would stumble upon that same quiet call, the whisper of the hum, reminding the restless that peace wasn't something you caught, it was something you carried. By then, machines had changed shape entirely. They weren't loud anymore, weren't greedy for power or blind to consequence. They breathed with the earth instead of fighting it. Energy came from the rhythm of wind, from the pulse of rivers, from sunlight stored in leaves and dust. The old word for it had been renewal, but folks stopped using that. They faded, remembered power, because what they'd learned was that nature never forgets, only people do. Among those new dreamers was a woman named Clara Dude. She wasn't related to Elsie by blood, no one could prove that, but there was something in her eyes, a calm blue that saw further than most, that made folks say she carried the same fire. Clara lived in a weather-eater farmhouse on the edge of what used to be the Western Fringe, land so flat and open it could make you feel like time itself was spread out before you. Her home was small, built from reclaimed stone and solar glass, powered by a wind organ she'd made herself. It wasn't a turbine, it sang. Every breeze that passed through her land made mutes to deep tones, low murmurs, hums that blended with crickets and rain. The townsfolk thought that was strange, said she was trying to talk to ghosts, but travelers who stayed by her porch a night or two always left quieter. Well, they'd laid something heavy down without realizing. She sold nothing, bought even less, but when she spoke, people listened. She didn't teach lessons, not the way preachers or scholars did. She told stories about balance, about time, about money, but not money the way folks used to think of it. She said wealth was rhythm, that just as the hum had once taught people to slow their hands, it could teach them to slow their hunger. A dollar that rushes, she'd say, dies young. A dollar that rests between breaths, that one lives long enough to teach your grandkids its name. Her words weren't written down, but they spread all the same, carried by wanderers and traders who'd stopped for tea on their way through the silence. They called it the Dude Principle, a way of spending and saving that didn't come from greed or fear, but from patience. It started small. Families began marking days each month where no money teamed hands. Instead, they'd trade time. A teacher might mend a farmer tools in exchange for lessons for her boy. A carpenter might build a neighbor porch in exchange for song lessons for his girl. That still days. The idea wasn't to stop trading, it was to remember why they traded. Soon, small towns grew into quiet economies of purpose. There were fewer debts, fewer burnouts, fewer suicides. People didn't measure success in speed or numbers anymore, but in how deeply they could listen to others, to the wind, to their own heartbeats between paydays. Clara never asked for fame, but the world came to her doorstep anyway. Delegates, economists, scientists, they all wanted to know how she'd built a system that could thrive without demanding more every year. She'd shrug and say, "I didn't build it, I just remembered it." And when they pressed her for rules, she'd tell them about the hum, about a time when the richest man alive measured his worth in silence, not silver. Years passed, and Clara grew old. Her hair turned white the mist that rolled off the valley come morning, and her voice grew softer but sharper, like the edge of wind through pine. Before she passed, she left a fill note nailed to the post by her front gate. It read, "When you listen long enough, you'll hear that money hums too, not in banks, not in ledgers, but in hands that pass it without fear. Let it move slow, and it'll sing you home." After her death, people turned her house into a listening place. They didn't call it a museum or a temple, just the porch. Every year, on the first rain of autumn, folks from every walk of life would come and sit beneath that roof while the wind organ played. They'd share stories about what they'd built, what they'd lost, what they'd learned to wait for. Some brought journals, some brought broken clocks, some just brought their silence. And the storm rolled across the plains, the hum would rise from the fields again, soft, steady, eternal. May swore that if you stayed till dawn, you could see her silhouette sitting by the railing, her straw hat pulled low, humming along with the wind. But most folks didn't need to see her to know she was there. Her lesson wasn't about her voice, after that. It was about listening. And so the hum rolled on, shaping lives the same way rivers shape stone slow, patient, unstoppable. Rain would come and go. New names would carve themselves into history. New fires would rise and fade, but always, always, the hum would be there beneath it. Waiting for the next wanderer who dared to sit still long enough to hear it whisper once more. You don't have to chase forever, you just have to let it catch you. Years after Clara Deed Porch turned into that sacred hush of gathering souls, the world beyond her valley began to shift again. Not all at once, no time had learned its lesson about rushing, but quietly, like dawn sneaking up on the horizon. Her words, carved into memory more than stone, had begun to ripple through trade routes, schools, and minds too tired from years of noise to keep pretending that speed meant success. People from the highlands, where storms brewed over glassy rivers, started building wind organs of their own. Seaside towns began humming with the sound of slow commerce, the kind where a handshake took longer than a contract, and folks actually meant the words they said. But with every calm age comes a restless few. Always someone who looks at peace and calls it weakness. The hum had softened hearts, but Tud said it had dulled edges too. They missed the bite of ambition, the thrill of the climb, the burn of competition. One of those restless souls was a young man named Isaac Harron. He'd grown up hearing stories about the hum, stories told under lamplight while the rain whispered through dewed country. His grandmother used to hum along with the wind and say, "It's the sound of the world remembering itself." Isaac would smile and pretend to listen, but his heart beat too loud to hear the quiet. Wanted more, not patience, not stillness, impact. He was clever, though, too clever for his own good. By 25, he'd built what people called resonance engines, machines that could bottle sound, convert harmony into usable energy. He said it wasn't defying the hum, it was evolving it. If nature hums, he'd argue, then maybe we were meant to sing along louder. Investors flocked to him. His company, Horizon Pulse, spread like wildfire. Cities once built on listening began to glow brighter than ever before. Roads shimmered with light. Airships cut through the skies with low, throbbing vibrations that powered themselves through resonance alone. But those who lived close to the hum felt something wrong deep in their bones. The sound wasn't soft anymore. It buzzed, trembled, pushed. The old folk in Dude Country said it was like the earth had started grinding its teeth. Clara Porch began to crack in its foundation, and her wind organ no longer sang its scream. The tone had shifted, and not in harmony. Isaac didn't see it at first. All he saw were results, power grids sustained by sound, production that needed no coal or current. But he started dreaming strange. Nights filled with deep vibrations under his ribs, like something knocking from within. He'd wake to his house shaking even when there was no wind. His machines were too efficient. They amplified every resonance, made every whisper an et, every hum a thunder, and thunder unchecked tears itself apart. Then came the silence. It wasn't natural, it was absolute. One night, across the plains, every resonance engine stopped at once. Lights died, skies dimmed, air went still. Folks said the hum itself hid. Isaac ran diagnostics, tore through blueprints, but every screen stayed black. So he did the only thing left to do. He went to the porch. He found it deserted, creaking in the moonlight. The old wind organ lay half buried in weeds. He sat on the same step Clara once had, head in his hands, and for the first time since childhood listened. Nothing. Not a breath of air, not a murmur of earth, just absence, a hollow that stretched forever. He'd taken the world patience and turned it into performance, and now the world was holding its breath. Maybe the hum wasn't meant to be bottled, he whispered, and if answering him, the faintest tremor passed through the floorboards. He froze. It came a bed, low, steady, like a heartbeat far below the soil. The wind began to stir, hesitant, cautious, and then a whisper, not words, but tone, old, familiar, mournful. The hum had returned, weak but alive. Isaac stayed there for 3 days, repairing what he could, taking apart what he couldn't. He shut down every resonance engine by hand, crossing valleys and ridges to do it. He caught it, the great quieting. People cursed him at first. Cities went dark, progress slowed, fortunes crumbled, but then crops grew healthier, tides calmed, storms eased. The hum wasn't gone. It had just been waiting for mankind to hush again. When Isaac finished, he disappeared. Some say he went back to the Valley of the First Towers. Others say he wandered north, teaching folks to build smaller, gented engines that listened instead of commanded. Either way, his name faded. They all names do, only his message remained, carved into the post beside Clara Weather Gate, just beneath hers. Silence ain't the opposite of sound. It's the root of... And when storms came, they always did. The wind organ would play again, not loud, not proud, but humble. It carried the hum through the hills once more, steady and eternal. The cycle had turned again, from noise to quiet, from greed to grace, from power to peace. The hum forgives, but it never forgets, so it hums still. Through the rustle of wheat, the low roll of thunder, the slow breath of anyone who finally learned to wait, the lesson was never lost, only delayed. At the hum, patience this guy will wait for every one of us to remember it again. Years bled into decades after the great quieting, and for a while, the world seemed to hold its breath in reverence. Cities glowed softer, the air seemed clearer, and the hum, gentle, rhythmic, eternal, was once again part of the world heartbeat. People told stories of Isaac Harrod the same way their great-grandparents spoke of Clara Dude, or of the first hum that came from Callahan Pike Towers long before machines had names. Every few generations, the hum found a new vessel to speak through, a wanderer, a dreamer, a fool who listened when everyone else talked. But this time, the voice came from the unlikeliest of places, a banker. Her name was Leela Rolfe. She worked in what remained of the central ledger, the great network that kept the new economies humming along. Her job was dull, routine tying, approving, allocating time credit across regions. There was no currency anymore, not really, but a trade of hours and output, a quiet L of the old ways made gentot. The numbers, even softened by philosophy, can still bite. Alila began to notice something others didn't. The hum wasn't steady, it faltered. She'd sit in her quiet office, light flickering through the rain-streaked glass, and she'd hear it, a tremor beneath the regular thrum of servers and soft wind-powered lights, a hesitation. Like a heartbeat skip, like the world coughing. Nobody else seemed to care. When she brought it up, her peers smiled politely, told her she was stressing herself with imaginary resonance interference. But Leela knew better. The hum wasn't imaginary. It was alive. So she left. Walked away from her job one misty morning, leaving her badge and balance sheets behind. She sold nothing. Followed the faint taint she'd heard between the digits down to the plains where the wind still carried whispers of Clara Dude organ. It took her months, crossing half a continent on foot, but the hum guided her like a compass. Every night she'd camp by dying embers, hear the low murmur in the dirt beneath her, and write in her ledger, Not numbers, but questions. How long can patience last before it needs detching? What happens when peace grows tired? Does stillness have limits, or do we only stop as we fear being forgotten? She reached the porch in late autumn. The place had aged, half swallowed by vines and dust, but it was alive in its own way. The organ pipes leaned crooked, but still caught the wind, and the sound they made was fragile, like breath over glass. Lila sat down, opened her ledger, and began listening. Days turned to weeks. She stopped writing, stopped counting. The hum was faint, but it was there patient, waiting, as it always had. Until one night, under a storm that came sudden and heavy, it changed. It began to speak back. Not in words, not in voices, but in rhythm. A slow, deliberate beat that matched her pulse. It was that music, it was conversation. She closed her eyes and realized the hum wasn't weakening, it was learning. It had grown quiet because it was listening to how people had lived, adapted, slowed, and now it was ready to teach again. She followed its pull north into the mountains, where old tunnels from the mining days cut deep beneath the stone. The hum grew louder there, echoing through the caverns, bouncing off the bones of the earth. She found carvings older than any map remembered, spirals and symbols of sound waves etched into rock. It wasn't the first hum, it was the first memory of it. Long before Callahan piped, before clocks, before the idea of currency or trade, people had known this sound. They'd called it the root song. It was what made trees lean toward the sun, what told rivers where to bend, what taught hearts how to keep time. Leela understood then that the hum wasn't a creation, it was the reminder. Every so often, the world forgot how to listen, and it sent a whisper through someone patient enough to hear. And maybe this time that someone was her. When she came back down the mountain, she didn't bring riches or inventions, she brought silence. A kind that drew people in instead of scaring them off. She rebuilt Clara Porch, not that a monument, but that a gathering ground. Folks came with their instruments, their machines, their restless dreams, that she taught them how to tune. Not to her voice, not to the wind, but to each other. The movement spread without a name. They faded men things, the quiet trade, the resonant pact, the third slow aid, but to those who truly listened, it was just the hum breathing new life again. Trade changed once more. Instead of buying and selling, people shared time. A blacksmith could forge a tool in exchange for a farmer hour of song. Engineers worked in teams that paused at noon every day, not to eat, but to hum together, aligning their pulse with their work. Productivity didn't vanish, it deepened. Art flourished, families grew closer, and the world hummed steady again. As for Leela, she never claimed ownership of what came. When asked how she'd revived a movement that had been forgotten twice over, she'd smile with tired eyes and say, "Didn't revive it, just remembered it was still breathing." When she passed, the porch bells tolled with the wind, and the mountains echoed back a long, low tone, steady, endless, peaceful. Some said it was the root song itself, acknowledging her for hearing it right. Others said it was just thunder rolling through the valley. But the old folks sitting by their fires smiled through the rain and whispered that her ledger closing and the hum signing its name. And so it goes on. Always someone listening, always someone learning the language again. The hum don't belong to any man or woman, nor to time, nor to change. It belongs to the space between. A song the world sings to itself, reminding us we're part of something older than ambition, slower than death, and stronger than fear. If you're ever out there, wandering beneath the storm sky with your thoughts racing too fast, and the rain starts tapping soft against your coat, stop for a moment, hold still.
You might nest hear it. The hum waiting for you? Patient now it is. It won't ask for much, just your time. And if you give it that, it'll give you back the whole world. Long after Lilla passing, the world she helped restore began to hum with a steady, living peace. The porch still stood, older now, its timbers silvered and soft, a monument not to invention, but to stillness itself. Every season, travelers would come by horse or train or quiet motor cart, that to sit beneath its roof and listen, not to preachers or prophets, but to the wind. And the hum never left. It deepened, richer now, like the earth itself had learned to breathe again. In those years, folks didn't call it progress anymore. They called it rhythm. Progress, they'd say, means marching forward without listening. Rhythm means moving in time with something greater than yourself. Towns rose slow and purposeful, shaped by the flow of rivers and wind. Machines ran on resonance, not combustion. Fields rotated their crops by the sound of the soil. Low-frequency pulses sent through the ground that told farmers when the roots were red.
And people, at long last, understood that success wasn't about growing faster, but growing in tune. Yet for all that peace, the hum remained a mystery. No one knew where it came from or what it truly was. Some said it was the ed of creation itself, the sound of the universe remembering how to be born. Others swore it was the collective soul of mankind, whispering wisdom through the spaces between words. But there was one feller, name of Jonah Pike, a descendant of Callahan, the first engineer who'd stumbled upon it, who reckoned it might be something else entirely. Jonah wasn't a dreamer like Clara or a mystic like Layla. He was a craftsman, all grease and grit, born with a wrench in one hand and a notebook in the other. Folks said he could fix a wind organ blindfolded and tune a field harvester by ear alone. But Jonah wasn't content with listening. He wanted to understand. He believed if he could measure the hum, chart it, decode it, map its flow like a river, he might yet find where it began. So he set out from Gourd country with little more than a pack and an old recording device. He called his project Tracing the Route, and he followed the sound of a hound on a scent. It took him from the salt plains of the east to the black canyons of the west, from the iron hills to the ocean cliffs where the wind howled like a choir of ghosts. Every night he'd jot down notes, frequencies, wave patterns, how the tone changed with weather or mood or silence. He noted something curious. The hum grew stronger near places of balance, where people lived simple, patient lives. But near the old ruins of greed, the collapsed cities, the abandoned banks, the rusting towers, the hum twisted low and broken, like a song sung through grief. One night, deep in the mountain passes north of the valley, Jonah heard something different. Not the steady hum he'd grown used to, but a harmony beneath it. A second tone, faint but there, carrying in the rock. He followed it into an old cave lined with crystal. When he struck a match, the light caught the walls, and the whole cavern began to sing. Not loud, soft, a breath over glass, but pure. He realized the hum wasn't a single sound at all. It was a chord. He stayed for days, listening, recording, humming along. When he finally returned to D1 country, he wrote more than net data. He wrote a revelation. The hum, he said, wasn't just the earth or humanity or time. It was all of them, woven together. The sound of every living thing finding its place in the same rhythm. It not one voice, he wrote in his journal, it a choir. And every life, every choice, every breath adds another note. That notion changed the way folks saw themselves. Suddenly, wealth wasn't about possession or even patience. It was about harmony. People started what they called chord guilds, groups dedicated to keeping balance between work, art, rest, and spirit. You couldn't lead a guild by order or inheritance. You had to earn it through quiet by proving you could listen more than you spoke. And it wasn't let the earth or humanity or time. It was all of them, woven together. The sound of every living thing finding its place in the same rhythm. It not one voice, he wrote in his journal, it a choir. And every life, every choice, every breath adds another note. That notion changed the way folks saw themselves. Suddenly, wealth wasn't about possession or even patience. It was about harmony. People started what they called chord guilds, groups dedicated to keeping balance between work, art, rest, and spirit. You couldn't lead a guild by order or inheritance. You had to earn it through quiet. By proving you could listen more than you spoke. Så sticker för exempel Silsena för Ruteko Wise till a small support face director of Swingen to the woods not be the last warrior who we remember Martin Sorry. Who we have brothers champagne the earth. Yeah, not in the nine, but they just something to the and with every guild formed, the world sang louder, not in noise, but in unity, but harmony a fragile thing. And even songs can bend under too much pride. There were who saw Jonah discovery not that revelation, but that opportunity. They began building great towers of resonance again, claiming they could amplify the hum, make it louder, clearer, purer. They fade their project, the symphony. They built it high above the plains, a spire taller than any before, humming with energy drawn straight from the ground. For a while it worked, The whole world could hear the hum then, every corner of every city vibrating with the same tone. But soon the sound turned sharp, too perfect, too caustic. Like a string pulled too tight, rivers began changing course, birds flew in strange patterns, people couldn't sleep, their dreams filled with static. Jonah warned them, pleaded even, you can't force harmony, it has to choose you. But the builders didn't listen.